Soundings Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of An Awkward Commission, written by David Donachie, read by Peter Wickham. The moral right of the author has been asserted. Chapter 1. The square was full of people, the ground covered in a putrid mixture of human and animal ordure, laced with blood and white viscous entrails that sucked at his boots. Try as he might, John Pearce struggled to make headway through the solid crowd, ogres that turned their hideous faces towards him with a terrifying grin or a wide-open mouth, each yelling a different, indistinct message. In that mire at his feet, he had to step over couples publicly copulating, the women sewing together their cockades of red, white, and blue as they ground out their carnal pleasure with obvious glee. In the background stood the outline of a heavy wooden scaffold, the floor set high so that it was visible to all the dregs of Paris. On that wooden frame stood the lethal guillotine, the silver blade, caught by shafts of strong sunlight, dropping with a deadly thud at regular intervals, to be raised again and again, dripping blood, the whole accompanied by a constant funereal drum roll, interspersed with exultant cries at raised, detached heads. The winged horse came from nowhere, and soon he was mounted above both crowd and scaffold, looking down on the sea of faces that filled the huge stone-built quadrangle of the Place de la Révolution, and all the while that rhythmic thud continued. Very obvious was the snaking line of scarecrow-like victims that ran all the way from the scaffold steps back to the River Seine and along the bank of the sluggishly flowing river. There it broke up, one line extending across the Pont Neuf to the Conciergerie, stone walls 10 feet thick, grey and forbidding, like a malignant womb, others to the prisons of Châtelet and La Force, each converging inmate waiting their turn to offer up their heads to the killing machine of the Revolution. Swooping down like Bellerophon astride Pegasus, he came face to face with his own father, moving along to his fate. Not the man he had seen last, but the younger, healthy Adam Pearce who had raised him. He spoke, his deep, strong voice full of the passion for truth that had been his greatest asset, as well as the cause of his ultimate downfall. For a brief moment John was a boy again, his hand warm in that of his only living parent, and the snaking line had gone. They seemed to be on a road of some kind, a brick pave that led to a sparkling citadel, all gleaming spires and snow-white walls, the very image of paradise shining in a never-reducing distance. Perhaps the home he had never known, but always longed for. But that faded as the slow thud, thud, thud came again, and he watched aghast as slowly and inexorably his father, aged and withered, the hair going from black to grey to white, the voice from power to a sickly wheeze, the body shrinking until he was reduced to a thin-haired and blood-drained head, held in the outstretched hand of a fat, leather-clad and grinning executioner, while behind and below him that vicious crowd screamed in a paroxysm of homicidal ecstasy. It was the furious cry of a boatman that woke him, that and the summer sunlight streaming through an uncurtained window right onto his eyelids, though he had no knowledge of what was being shouted, only that fulsome curses were being employed. Pearce lay in the bed for a whole minute listening to that repeated thud before he could place it, and in doing so come to a knowledge of where he was. The night before seemed as misty a memory as the horrible dream from which he had just surfaced. His dry mouth and leather tongue, plus the sour taste on his palate, told him that he had been drunk long before the lump of swollen flesh at the back of his throat gave him some idea of how much he had indulged in open-mouthed snoring. The thudding sound continued, and it took time for him to realize it was that of a boat snubbing on the wooden jetty outside and below his window, striking the timbers each time it was lifted by a wave running into the deepest reaches of Portsmouth harbour. Lifting himself to drink from a pitcher by his side, he groaned at the pain that seared through the top of his head, swallowing greedily to turn his tongue from fur to flesh, as some of what had happened the day before came back to him. That and all that occurred these last few months, a whirlwind of the press gang, service at sea, storms, fighting the enemy less often than authority, and in doing so establishing the kind of friendships that a life of wanderings with his radical father had never allowed. What now of the confidence with which he had arrived in Portsmouth, sure in the knowledge that a promise he had made to the trio with whom he had been press-ganged months before would be fulfilled? That they would, like him, have the freedom to follow their own wishes rather than stay as enforced sailors in King George's navy? He recalled the look of sheer pleasure on the midshipmen's face as he informed this fellow, attired now in the uniform of a lieutenant, that those he had come to free were no longer in the anchorage or aboard HMS Centurion, but had been shipped out on another vessel bound for the Mediterranean, condemned to continue to serve because he had dallied for a day or two longer than he should have in the arms of a beautiful, wealthy, and indulgent woman. Stood on the deck of the 50-gun warship, he looked on in dazed silence, at a loss to make sense of what had occurred, as the carpenters worked away to repair the damage inflicted in the recent action, fitting new bulwarks and deck planking where they had been blown in or scarred by cannon fire. Others peddling fast-turning lathes, carving out the newel posts and uprights that would make up the replacement staircase rails. All around in the Spithead anchorage lay the might of Britain's wooden walls, the great ships that were all that stood between tyranny and what the inhabitants of Albion took to be liberty. All the while that midshipman stood there, silent but mocking, declining the idea that he might provide further explanation. The return journey across the anchorage seemed to add to that contempt, the hired wherry taking him past the damaged stern of Valmy, the 74-gun French ship that he, along with his companions, had helped to capture. Soon, no doubt, she too would be repaired, would be renamed under a British flag before being sent back to sea, there to challenge those vessels which had once been her consorts. Ashore, Pearce had headed straight to a tavern crowded with soldiers, sailors, and as many locals, dockyard mateys, costermongers, draymen, and a sprinkling of fly types, ordering a flagon of French brandy and damn the expense, thus attracting attention to himself, for being now contraband, that was an expensive beverage. A fellow drinker identified him as the hero of the recent action. He had seen him come ashore 10 days before, the talk of a port that lived off the King's navy and loved a victory. That had led to bumper after bumper to celebrate the first true triumph of the latest French war, drinks consumed with relish by a man who had no desire to think, only to forget. Now he knew he was in a narrow bed, but not precisely where. Knew he felt like death, but was wholly alive. Knew that he still had on the breeches, silk stockings, and silver-buckled shoes bought for him by the generous Lady Annabel Fitzherbert. Sat up, he could see his new coat, dark blue, heavy broadcloth, was crumpled on the floor along with his black silk naval hat. A quick feel of his purse told him it was still inside his breeches and still near full, which led him to suspect that he had got very drunk on the coin and generosity of others, which was shaming. Head bent, Pearce reacted too sharply to the creaking door, and sent a shaft of pain through his temples, which meant the person who entered addressed a man with his eyes shut tight and his head in his hands. "There you are, sir, up and about at last. We had you down to sleep a month after the state you came to us in." The face, when he lifted his head and opened his eyes, was female, round, rosy-cheeked and affable, though the smile was without a single tooth, which gave the voice a lisping quality. "Now it strikes me, you being the hero you are, that a proper breakfast is in order. That is, after the necessary, of course." The necessary turned out to be a herbal infusion of the innkeeper's own making, though there was a telling dose of alcohol in the brew, rough to be sure, arrack most likely, given it burnt the back of his throat. He had to drink it straight down, for the maker of the potion was stood before him, fists on a pair of hips so substantial that they would have stood comparison to a 3-ton barrel. Her eyes were narrow and determined, to ensure it went straight down to the seat of the problem, for, as the landlady said, "Though the pain might be in your head, young sir, to be sure the seat of your malaise lies deep in the vital parts, and short in your entrails, where the soul of man resides. The necessary first, and perhaps a good evacuation, will see you renewed. Take my word for it, sir, for I have seen many a fellow in your condition and worth, my own late husband not least. In half a glass of sand you will be as right as rain, and tucking into a fine beefsteak or two washed down with my own true porter, or I, Peg Bamber, am not the widow of a blue-water sailor." Peg Bamber had the right of it. Not that a clearer head and a well-satisfied belly brought much in the way of true relief, for John Pearce was faced in clarity with the same dilemma which had plagued him these last months: how to get his mates, those men he called his fellow pelicans, off the ship in which they had been sent to sea. Sat in his shirt-sleeves, looking out of the window by which he sat, for Peg insisted he eat in his room. "Why, young sir, to enter the tap-room is to invite a return to the state in which you came upstairs this fortnight." Pearce ran his eye over the bustling inner port. There were 1 or 2 vessels tied up to the shore, and over the nearest water a pair in dry dock. But the main part of the armada was some way out, with a stream of boats and hoys carrying people and supplies to and fro. His friends, Michael O'Hagan, Charlie Taverner, and young Rufus Dommett, had been on that very water no more than 5 days before, no doubt anxiously looking over the ship's rail for a sight of him to come to rescue them. He had failed them, just as he had so recently failed his own father. As elements of that dream with which he had awoken came back to him, he began to talk in order to mask out the feelings it induced. "The name confuses, sir," lisped Peg Bamber when he alluded to the problem of the pelicans. "We were all press-ganged not 5 months past from a tavern. It was called the Pelican and stood by the banks of the River Thames." "London, sir, a hateful place, I am told, where it ain't safe to walk the streets." Pearce took another draw on the tankard of porter. Sure, he could feel in his gut the way it was doing him good, sipping as he explained the illegality of what had happened that night, but leaving out the fact that he himself had been on the run from the law and a King's Bench warrant, and had only gone into the Pelican to escape pursuit and, if caught, imprisonment. "In seeking to secure ourselves against the malice of others, and as a badge of our shared misfortune, we adopted the name of Pelicans as a sobriquet." "I have no notion of what a sobriquet is, sir, but I do know that pleading to me will get you not one whit forward. The only authority that can gainsay your quandary is the Admiral himself." "How?" "Why, it's as plain as the nose on your face," Peg insisted, lifting his plate and popping into her mouth the long slice of fat Pearce had trimmed from the edge of his beefsteak. "You must ask the Admiral to fetch them back. A fast pinnace will have no trouble coming up on a 74, as long as their course is known. Even a naval widow knows that." "Admiral Lord Howe," said Pearce patiently, wondering if Peg really knew what she was talking about. He might consider himself no tarpaulin, but he did know that spotting another ship at sea, even if you had a fair notion of its course, was hit and miss at best, and in 24 hours, even at a medium rate of sailing, she could be 100 miles down channel. "Black Dick Howe!" Peg exclaimed, finally getting his drift. "Why, only God knows how a man can run a fleet of ships from Bath." Seeing the look on Pearce's face, she added, "The crabbed old bugger has gone to take the waters, young sir, and no doubt to try and get his old bones a fit for dalliance, which is fanciful in a man of his years, and all the while we are at risk of an enemy sailing in to burn and make devilment. It is to be hoped he can post-chaise back here faster than the French can cross the waters, the idle dog." "It was he who said the matter would be taken care of." "Then let us hope he remembers, though I has to say it ain't common in those of his advanced years. He's not more'n a lick and a spit off 70, the old goat. Happen you should try Admiral Graves, who does all the work for Black Dick, and if rumour has it right, suffers the brickbats for it not being done quick enough." One of Peg's girls came into the room holding his coat and hat, the former having been steamed and pressed, while his hat had been brushed to remove what Peg called half the mud of the alleys in which he had rolled. The conversation that ensued as he dressed himself established who and what Graves was, second in command of the Channel Fleet, and an irascible man with much to be irascible about. "You will need to boat out to his ship to see him at all," Peg added with a loud disapproving sniff. "He abides to the rule that it is sinful for anyone to sleep ashore, admiral to mid, which makes him the devil incarnate to folk who make their coin from accommodating and feeding the likes of your good self. Instead, he fills the purses of bumboatmen and their floating harlots. Not that tars don't need comfort, sir, but—" Pearce stopped the indignant flow by agreeing with her, then establishing that Admiral Graves was aboard his flagship, HMS Royal Sovereign. "Shall I send a girl to bespeak you a boat?" Please, and I will settle what I owe in case I do not return." "A hearty bill, sir," Peg exclaimed, opening her mouth to show pink gums. "You treated the good folk of Portsmouth well this fortnight, and paid for more sore heads than your own. I'll grant you the cure gratis, as is only fitting for a hero, the second I've had under my roof for this present war." "The second?" said Pearce, distracted by the thought of what might be a substantial bill, and the disturbing thought that he might not be able to meet it. "Why, yes, sir. I had a lad even younger under my eaves a month or two back, a midshipman as brave as you, sir, to judge by his tale. Young Mr. Burns, for that was his name, took a ship from right under the noses of Jean Crapaud, from out of the very harbour in which it was berthed, if you please, and brought her back to her home shore." Peg Bamber stopped, nonplussed by the look of deep anger in John Pearce's face. "I know Mr. Burns, madam, and I can assure you, were the truth of his tale to be known, he would be whipped rather than lauded." Pearce, recalling the pasty face of Toby Burns, of the boy's utter uselessness and the bland betrayal he had perpetrated on himself and the very men he had come to Portsmouth to rescue, had to fight not to add more than that bitter condemnation. But he had to stop. It was no concern of this woman that Burns was a lying little toad, even if he could not suppress his feelings entirely. His voice, when he spoke, carried the strain of a man holding an exceedingly unpleasant memory in check. "I thank you, Mrs. Bamber, for your care and attention." The reply was a pretty curtsy, even in a woman of her size, and, mouth closed and frame diminished, it was possible to see the quite comely girl she must have once been. But the eyes had a sudden glint when she added, "I'll see to your account, sir." Several guineas lighter, John Pearce left Peg Bamber's, making his way to the shoreline of the Common Hard, where the boat Peg's girl had engaged was waiting, drawn up on the shingle. It turned out to be a family concern, a conjugal affair, and once paid a shilling in advance for their trouble, the husband and wife saw it as part of their task to entertain their passenger with an unrelenting amount of mutual abuse, about their abode, the job from which they made their living, even their intimacy, with each in turn looking to him at some point for support. "A pigsty, sir, that's where I live." "Then it be above your station, that's for certain," spat the wife, a thick-armed crone with an unlit clay pipe clamped in her teeth. She looked to be twice as strong as her spouse, who was weedy and wiry, with a pinched, unhealthy face, albeit perfectly able to match her pace on the oar. "Just like the stick you are. You're not fit to be a crossing sweeper." "I would have to sweep hard to clear your filth." A look to the passenger followed, his eyes searching sympathy from his own gender. "And no warmth, sir. Not a drop of it. Just a cold shoulder." "Would that you had something to warm a woman, you spavin dog." Pearce tried to shut out the sound of their mutual bickering, and looked away so that neither could engage him in their cause. That dream surfaced again in all its horrible clarity, because these were the kind of folk for whom his father had argued passionately all his life. Adam Pearce had travelled the length and breadth of the country, his son in tow, trying to better the lot of the dispossessed. He would speak at the stump of whichever place they stopped, to lambast the comfortable and extol the intrinsic worth of the poor, who only needed an education to be as fine as those who saw themselves as their betters. And John Pearce had, for he was too young to do otherwise, shared such opinions, even as he sought to avoid being robbed of the contents of his hat, usually copper, rarely silver, by the offspring of the very audience his father was addressing. Those sentiments had even survived a spell in the Fleet prison, for Adam Pearce had a carapace of social faith every bit as strong as that of the most committed adherent of religion. It was not one his son now shared. Age and growing independence, added to what he had seen in Paris in the 2 and a bit years they had spent there, had cured him. Were the pair on the oars the same kind of canaille who had emerged from the eastern slums of Paris to ruin the Revolution, filthy specimens with brains that could encompass no other thought than greedy violence, the types who had torn down the Bastille stone by stone? And if that was a laudable event, joyously hailed even in Britain as an end to royal tyranny, what followed over the months and years became progressively less so. He had seen the likes of this pair covered from head to bare foot in fresh blood, running under flaming torches through the streets of Paris, bearing heads on pikes that they had hacked off from their dead victims, and screaming of how many more would die. "Name, sir?" demanded the boatman. "We's a-comin' under Royal Sovereign's counter." "Pearce, John Pearce," he replied, looking up at the towering three-decker and the mass of gilded carving that decorated her stern. Then he added a word that still sounded bizarre to his ears. "Lieutenant." Once alongside, the fellow called over his shoulder to the entry port, a dark hole in the ship's side framed by the climbing battens that would be needed to get aboard at sea. Here they had fitted a long, sloping gangway. "Lieutenant Pearce seeking permission to come aboard, Your Honour." "Your Honour?" called a voice from the interior. "You ain't talking to me, that's for certain." Two sailors emerged, boathooks at the ready, one taking the prow of the wherry to haul it in, the other more rigid to steady the approach of the stern. "Boat your oars, fellas, for if you scrape the paint, it'll be my guts." "One of 'em's a woman, I reckon, Clem," said the other sailor. "You don't say!" Clem shouted, looking hard at the female in the boat, all wild grey hair and wrinkled skin. "Then make sure when I is soused in ashore, mate, that I stay well clear of her, for old Nick hisself would blanch to be seen coupling with that." "One of these days, husband, I might find a tar with enough to please a woman, but I doubt it be this one." "I make you right there, Susie, my love," her husband replied, in the softest and most defensive of voices, making it clear that civility came to them only when they were faced with an external insult. On what now seemed a steady platform, Pearce stood up, wondering at a life like theirs in which the next meal had been probably uncertain since birth. But he was soon obliged to think more of his own immediate safety as the wherry was pulled in, nearly knocking him off balance. About to step onto the gangway, he stopped dead when the sailor called Clem cried out, "Right foot first, sir! Where has you put your wits?" He had to skip to get his right foot on the wooden platform first, and thus avoid the opprobrium of condemning the whole ship to perdition through the act of ignoring a superstition. Up he went to enter the dim interior, to be greeted by a midshipman who raised his hat. Pearce did likewise, distracted as he glanced along the empty main deck, then wondered at the look on the boy's face as he put it back on. Quickly he raised it again, half turning to salute the unseen quarterdeck, mentally kicking himself to remember the things that an officer was supposed to do on coming aboard. "I have come to see Admiral Graves." "Have you indeed, sir?" replied the boy. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." The boy sighed. "Then I fear you were in for a long wait. Best bespeak the officer in charge of the anchor watch and see if he will allow you the use of the wardroom." "Obliged. Follow me, sir." He was led across the gloomy deck to a wide stairway that led up to the quarterdeck. There they found the man presently in charge of the ship, likewise a lieutenant, in an unadorned blue working coat, who, on being introduced, immediately inquired as to the date of his commission. Admitting it to be only days old, brought forth a puffed chest and the information that this man was his superior by 3 years. Only then did he ask his name, and a raised eyebrow went with the reply. "Pearce of the Griffin? The fellow who was spoke of in the local journal only last week?" Trying to look modest, Pearce nodded. "Damn you, Tate!" the officer barked at the mid. "You best learn, you pint-sized blackguard, to execute proper introductions." "Sorry, sir," said the boy, abashed, though clearly he was equally confused. "You will be." With Pearce, all condescension disappeared. "Allow me, sir, to shake your hand, for that was a worthy exploit, and it warms our cockles to look out over the taffrail and see the ship you helped to take. I would be less than honest, sir, if I did not tell you it stirs a little jealousy also, for we would all wish to have such luck." A vision of the bloodshed that had attended the capture floated into Pearce's mind, which sat uneasily with the concept of luck. "The Admiral has much to attend to and a queue of supplicants, but I'm sure your name will see you well up the list." There was a pause then, before the lieutenant added, "But was you not a midshipman, sir?" "I was, sir, but the King at his levee saw fit to insist that I be promoted, hence the newness of my commission. The commander of HMS Griffin was made a post-captain at the same time." Pearce did not add that the Earl of Chatham, First Lord of the Admiralty, had objected to his elevation, only to be overruled by his own younger brother, the King's absurdly young First Minister. He was later told by the lovely Lady Annabel that William Pitt was more concerned with the state of the monarch's health and the maintenance of his government than the propriety of promoting a man who lacked any of the qualifications that the post demanded. In a parliament riven with competing ideas and policies, Pitt commanded a tenuous majority which required constant manoeuvring to sustain. War with France was not universally popular. Indeed, there were those who would make peace on the morrow if they could just gain power. The ministry of Pitt was based on Tory support, but that was not unanimous. Yet the opposition Whigs were no more united, some sections inclining to the government view that the revolution must be contained, the majority of that faction lining up behind Pitt's great rival, Charles James Fox, to challenge the government on every issue, from the war itself to the prosecution of the conflict, egged on by the power-hungry heir to the throne. Pitt's party was the one favoured by King George, who could not be other than opposed to a radical polity in Paris, which had executed his fellow monarch, King Louis of France, a few months previously. But George III had been declared mad just 3 years before, which had created a political crisis, and it was feared by all that the affliction which had rendered him unfit to govern would return. The Prince of Wales and his Whig supporters longed for such a thing, for in a declared regency with the King's heir apparent as head of state, they, not Pitt's Tories, would hold the power. To the King's First Minister, indulging an unstable king with an inappropriate promotion was obviously a small price to pay for the security of office. The advancement of Colborne to the rank of post-captain brought forth a gleam of near avarice in Pearce's fellow officer. "Then I envy your Mr. Colborne, sir, his promotion even more than I envy you." "He lost an arm, and I do believe he has to face a court-martial." "A formality, sir, nothing more." Clearly to this fellow the loss of a limb or a ship counted for less than Colborne's new rank. "What is that when you are made post? Why, a man on the captain's list is a man made for life, with a flag on the horizon if the good Lord spares you. I long for nothing more, sir, as I'm sure you do too. Mr. Tate, take Lieutenant Pearce to the wardroom as my guest, and tell the steward that he is to waive the normal contribution we ask of visiting officers to our fund." Pearce was about to demur when the lieutenant added, "It is the bane of life on a flagship, sir, the law of hospitality. We are obliged to levy a charge, for we are called upon to feed all and sundry as they wait for their interview, which would devastate without recompense our private stores. But you, sir, are an exception, a worthy guest. Meanwhile, I will tell the Admiral's clerk who's come a-calling." To enter the wardroom of a vessel this size, 100 guns or more, was a revelation to John Pearce. It could not be said to be spacious, yet compared to that allotted to the common seaman, or what he had experienced so far, it was luxury indeed, with a long table across the room and small screened-off cabins to either side. 3 marine officers and another lieutenant were playing backgammon, while others, close to flickering candles or the 5 transom casements, read their books or wrote letters. "Forgive me, Mr. Pearce, while I inform the Premier of your presence." Going to the rear, the boy rapped on a wooden door. There was another on the opposite side, a private space of proper cabins for the 2 most senior officers under the captain. The disinterest with which he had been greeted on entering the wardroom, for visitors were so commonplace, evaporated as the first lieutenant emerged from his quarters, a beaming smile on his face and a shout on his lips. "Steward, fetch the best claret. We have a fellow on board deserving of a toast." Named, they gathered round him, trying to feed him cup after cup of wine, but Pearce, obliged by the welcome to relate every detail of the recent action, stayed as abstemious as was possible, knowing that he needed a clear head for what was to come. More troubling was the technicality of the questions he was asked about courses, wind strength, gun calibers, and the effect of various weights of shot on the lighter scantlings of a French ship, all of which he struggled to answer out of sheer ignorance. He wanted to tell him that his entire time at sea would not amount to much more than 5 months, that he had read his books, but not enough. Yet he knew that such disclosure would be unwelcome, so he tried his best to satisfy their curiosity, drawing the elements of the action on the wardroom table with a finger dipped in his wine. It was with some relief that he was finally dragged off to see the Admiral, with an admonition from the First Lieutenant to be their guest that afternoon at dinner. Young Tate was again obliged to guide him, this time past 2 marine sentries who stood at the door to the anteroom of the Admiral's quarters, and once inside that, to introduce him to an officious-looking civilian at a desk. "Your business, sir?" The voice was bored and dismissive, but that was as nothing to the look of utter disbelief on the fellow's pasty face as Pearce replied. His voice had all the arrogance of the job's worth, and when he spoke it was icy. "You have come all this way to importune the effective commander of His Majesty's Channel Fleet on the fate of a trio of ordinary seamen, indeed landsmen, who are, I must tell you, now sailing to be part of a fleet that will be commanded by another admiral, Lord Hood." "They are not ordinary to me, sir. They are my closest friends." "Then I wonder at your connection, sir, for it is uncommon rare for an officer to so term a sailor." "Perhaps more of that would make the Navy a happier occupation. Lord Howe specifically alluded to their case, sir, in the most positive manner, and were he here I am sure he would oblige me by fulfilling the promise he made. I have no doubt that Admiral Graves would be only too keen to carry out the expressed wishes of the actual commanding officer." The look that got, as the clerk stood up to reveal a body shaped like a pear, no shoulders and a fat behind, was tantamount to a denial. In fact, it implied that pigs might fly. "Wait here. I will ask Admiral Graves if he will see you." Half a minute passed before the clerk returned. "I am to show you through, though it is only your name that gains you an interview. Do not hold out any hope that the Admiral will oblige you." "Then there is no purpose in going in," snapped Pearce, who, though restrained in his consumption of the wardroom claret, had drunk too much to suffer any hint of condescension. "None, except that it is in the shape of an order that you do so, one which the Marines behind you would insist you obey." The Admiral sat at a round table, a slim man of some height, with a white wig over a long greying face and a firm jutting-out jaw. The table was covered in books and papers, all of them, from what Pearce could observe, official. He looked up at the man before him, standing to attention with his hat under his arm, with the quizzical expression of a less-than-pleased adult faced with a recalcitrant child. "I wanted to look you over for a second time, Pearce, for I was at the reception when you first came ashore." "I am sorry, sir, I don't recall. There were so many senior officers present." "I was happy to praise you then, but not now. I'm here to tell you that your elevation to your present rank is nothing short of a disgrace. There cannot be a serving officer who knows the truth of your promotion who is not incensed by it. 6 years' sea time is 6 years, sir, and the commission you hold demands it, as well as the knowledge a man gains in that period, something you ain't got under your belt." "Then you will be glad to know, sir, that I have no intention of applying for a place aboard a ship." That came out without thinking, and was acceptable as well as being true. Had Pearce left it there, he might have held some sway with the Admiral. But the devil was in him, as it often was when faced with authority, and what sympathy he might have elicited went right out of the casement windows as he added, "Nothing would induce me to serve in such a body. Your navy, sir, is riddled with tyranny and open corruption, and I can only suppose that those with the power to chastise the men who run the institution are afflicted with a kind of blindness. The trio I have alluded to were, like me, illegally pressed into the Navy by a blackguard called Barclay." "Ralph Barclay?" "The very same." "I know of Captain Barclay." Then you will know, sir, that he is not fit for the rank he holds. The man is a martinet of the worst kind, and a liar to boot." He was interrupted by a snarl. "You will withdraw that remark, sir, for you are taking liberties with the name of a respected officer in the King's Navy." "If he, sir, is respected, it says little for those he serves with or under. Get out! I demand you accede to the wishes of Lord Howe and do something to get those men back." "You can demand all you like, Pearce, and I must warn you, if you do not do as I say, you will be demanding from the cable tier, and you will be in chains while you do so. Your friends can serve for a decade for all I care. I repeat my words. Get out!" As Pearce turned to go, the Admiral added his final insult. "And get off my flagship with the utmost speed, for your presence defiles the deck." Then he shouted, "Marines, escort this blackguard to the entry port." Chapter 2. "Mr. Glaister's compliments, sir. He believes we have a sight of the French coast, and judging by the skyline, despite the recent blow, he feels we will have made a perfect landfall." "Please inform Mr. Glaister I will be on deck presently, and request him to signal HMS Firefly, although I dare say Captain Gould already knows." Crouched over the muster book of HMS Brilliant, Captain Barclay did not deign to look up at Midshipman Fairmallow, who, having delivered what he thought was a dramatic message deserving of attention, was obliged to turn about and leave the captain's cabin in a rather crestfallen manner, though he did elicit a nod and a smile from the captain's pretty young wife, busy at a piece of embroidery in which the name of the frigate was already completed. Several cushions with similar covers lay along the bench seats, giving, if not a feminine touch to the place, at least an atmosphere more gentle than that one would associate with such an austere commander as Ralph Barclay. From above their heads came the sound of repairs, as they had, in the last 24 hours, come through a vicious and sudden squall of the type that plagued ships in the Mediterranean, the kind that threw vessels on their beam ends with scant warning, so forceful and unexpected was the wind. Ralph Barclay was now listing the damage, as well as the materials, timber, cordage, and canvas, that was needed to make matters right, employing a small percentage of exaggeration that any examining clerk at the Navy Board would have to be eagle-eyed to spot. Given that he was personally responsible for everything of that nature on the ship, and could be obliged to pay from his own pocket for unjustified wastage, he was, in time-honoured fashion, taking the opportunity to create a handy excess. Next came the muster book, where he listed, alongside all the other things that pertained to the existence of his crew, the fact that 2 of them had broken limbs, and 1 a dislocation of the shoulder. The surgeon's report lay by his hand, which told him 1 break was clean, the other not, and an estimate of how long each would be under medical care. It was a tedious duty that should have fallen to a clerk, but the then impecunious Captain Barclay had sailed from England without one, keeping for himself a proportion of the pay for the office. Running his finger down the list of tobacco bought, clothing items deducted from pay, and the cost of treating their venereal afflictions, he came to the pencilled name of Ben Walker, lost overboard 2 weeks before. The time had come to use ink, and to discharge that sailor as D.D., dead in the execution of his duties, with the storm as an excuse. Keeping him on the muster for a few extra days made up for some of the depredations of the rats that infested the lower reaches below decks. This was carried out with the connivance of the purser, who stood to gain more than the captain by a little judicious accounting, for it would transpire that the late Ben Walker had bought quite a quantity of tobacco in the last 2 weeks, the cost of which, since it was the purser's private venture, would go straight into his account. Provided their ledgers agreed, no one would spot a discrepancy, nor would an eyebrow be raised to the notion of a man lost at sea, given it was a commonplace. For every man that the Navy lost in battle, they lost 10 to shipwreck, accident, and disease. "Is not Mr. Fairmallow's news of some importance, Captain Barclay?" Ralph Barclay looked up and smiled, struck not for the first time by the picture of sheer loveliness Emily presented, one of perfect harmony with the life she lived. All awkwardness was now gone, The months at sea had inured her to whatever the elements of shipboard life could bring her way, and he was even pleased at what he called her fripperies, those bits of decoration she seemed determined to create in order to make more domestic their living quarters. Gone was the gauche and embarrassed 17-year-old girl who had come aboard at Sheerness, who, in her ignorance, had embarrassed both his purse and his authority. Here was that creature grown to womanhood complete, though she had only added 1 year to her actual age. In short, she had become the perfect wife to a serving sea captain, and the 20-year gap between them, once a concern, seemed now to be irrelevant. "It is vital, my dear, and I would have been most put out had it not come. But it does not do to show too much zeal in these things, as I have told you before." Emily Barclay, even seated, managed an ironic bob. "The Captain's Majesty?" "Precisely. I am no enemy to enthusiasm in its place, but—" Ralph Barclay followed that pause with a smile, for that was one of the things that Emily Barclay had not understood in the early days. The way a captain must be seen in the eyes of those under him, stern but fair, remote yet approachable, a balancing act between tolerance and punishment that was difficult to achieve and hard to maintain. He felt he had managed it, despite some initial hiccups, and he had been helped by some good fortune in the article of prizes, which meant the crew could expect an addition to their pay, which always aided contentment. It was not pleasant to recall the way that his wife had challenged him over that fellow Pearce, who he had been forced to punish and then obliged to get rid of. She would not do that now. She would know better, that justice must sometimes give way to authority. "Would you care to join me on deck, my dear?" "Is there anything to see, husband?" "I doubt it. Land will have been spotted from the masthead, and even in an hour, given the heat of the day, it will be no more than a smudge on the horizon." "Then, if you do not mind, husband, I will visit the men who suffered injury in yesterday's storm." "Of course," he replied before calling to his steward, "Shenton, my hat!" As he closed the muster-book, Ralph Barclay promised himself that at the first opportunity he would employ a clerk to do the work that he had just completed. It would have to be someone who understood the meaning of discretion, as well as the need for certain reservations with the absolute facts. No captain could afford to tell the Admiralty and Navy Board everything, and a certain security lay in the fact that, though they claimed to be zealous, those clerks were in fact only too human. He had had to decline his wife's offer to undertake the work, for he knew she, of all people, being so delightfully ingenuous, would not comprehend that particular requirement. His officers removed their hats as he stepped onto the quarter-deck, each acknowledged by no more than a nod. First he looked at the slate and the course that had been chalked on, knowing that the ship's master, Mr. Collins, a man of extremely insecure temperament, would be made nervous by his action. His frigate, HMS Brilliant, with the sloop HMS Firefly in her wake, was making some 4 knots on a steady southwest breeze that was coming in nicely over her larboard quarter. He cast his glance upwards to where, amongst the taut sails, the topmen were working, splicing ropes that had parted in the squall, and re-roving blocks that had come apart from the falls. Forward, over the waist, the sailmaker and his assistants were sitting in a line repairing a damaged topsail, their long needles flying through the thick canvas, the whole of the work, on deck and aloft, overseen by Mr. Sykes, the boatswain. Here was another cause for satisfaction, a crew that, due to his constant training and stern attitude, had become efficient at their work, and warrant officers like Sykes, who had seemed uncertain at first, now relaxed and competent. They were not at the peak of perfection. That took years at sea to achieve, but they were nothing like the rabble with which he had put to sea. Likewise, in his first lieutenant he had an officer who understood what was required of him, that the deck be spotless, the cannonballs in the rope garlands black and chipped free of rust, the cannon tight to the ship's side, idle ropes perfectly coiled, and the crew quiet and industrious, yet ready at a moment's notice to go from peaceful sailing to fighting readiness. That had not been so when he had set off from Sheerness, but good fortune had attended the crews of HMS Brilliant in that respect too, ridding him of subordinates inclined to be contentious and replacing them with men who understood the need to obey. "Mr. Glaister," The lanky Scotsman, with his thin, near-skeletal face and startlingly blue eyes, replied to the implied question in a lilting Highland tone. "Masthead reports that our landfall is mountainous, sir, which leads me to suspect that if we are not dead set for the roads of Toulon, then we are not a hair's breadth off it." "Then, Mr. Collins, you need to be congratulated." The master took the compliment, even though he knew how much of a hand his captain had had in the plotting of the course. So did every officer aboard. But praise from Ralph Barclay was rare enough to be prized, even when it was not truly warranted. "Mr. Glaister, I take it the work of repair will be completed before we can see the shore from the deck?" "I will make sure of it, sir." Ralph Barclay picked up a telescope and trained it on the distant shore, though it hardly made it any more clear. "Good. For if it is Toulon, they will have lookouts on the mountain and communications with the port, and some expectation of the imminent arrival of a reconnaissance vessel." "You mean they might wish to chase us off, sir?" "It is what I would do, Mr. Glaister. It is what I would do." Replacing the telescope in the rack, Ralph Barclay walked to the weather rail and began to pace up and down that space between the poop and the waist which all vacated, it being the preserve of the captain when he was on deck. His orders obliged him to reconnoitre the main enemy naval base and report back to Admiral Hotham and the fleet the state of readiness of the French capital ships in the port. If the commanding enemy admiral had any sense, he would have frigates at sea to intercept such a mission. That they had raised the land without such a sighting implied that he had not. What did it mean? Was the Toulon fleet in the kind of disarray rumoured to have ruined French naval strength, with experienced officers fled from their posts for fear of the guillotine? Or was it a ruse? "Mr. Glaister, break out a tricolour flag and raise it to the masthead." "Sir." "And keep our own pennant ready to replace it in an instant. I would also like to shorten sail so that repairs will be completed and the men will have had their dinner by the time the shore is hull up." "Should we clear for action, sir?" "After the officers' dinner, Mr. Glaister. As you know, my wife goes to great trouble to help the cook prepare a memorable meal. It would not do to upset her." He looked at them all then in a sweeping glance that had everyone avoiding his eye. There wasn't a man-jack aboard, before and abaft the mast, who was not as jealous as hell of their uxorious captain and his lovely lady. To see her on deck, common enough in benign weather, was to induce feelings best left ashore, some mere nostalgia for hearth and home, others more carnal, that mixed with resentment that Barclay should be so favoured. He was so much his wife's senior, and did not reckon himself handsome or very attractive a person, something with which most of his crew, had he asked them, would have concurred. But he had her companionship in all respects, in a way denied to the others aboard, if you discounted the gunner's wife, exasperating to men who had not been ashore for months. The satisfaction to be gained from the knowledge of their emotions was one of which he could never get enough, for Ralph Barclay reckoned that he had lived a life that owed him some recompense for miseries suffered, slights endured, and ambitions thwarted. Now he was enjoying the feeling of justified redress, as he turned on his heel and left the quarterdeck, his parting words, "Mr. Glaister, once you are sure all is in hand, please join me in my cabin. I need to hear your opinion on who amongst the ship's corporals is to replace the master-at-arms. Mr. Lutchins informs me he will be unable to fulfil his duties for some 6 weeks. "Mrs. Barclay." Lutchins looked up from the large journal in which he was writing. Habit made him half close it, so that what was written couldn't be seen. Silly, really, for of all the people aboard, this young lady would be the last person to pry. She was too well-mannered. "I came to see if our injured are comfortable, Mr. Lutchins." "They will certainly be made more so by your presence, madam. I fear they see in me a rough and indifferent medical man." Emily waved away such a suggestion, in truth to cover a degree of embarrassment, for gossip from her husband's officers, as well as the odd overheard remark from the men, had it that Lutchins was a touch insensitive in the article of pain, much given to applying herbal treatments which he supposed to be relieving, but failed to dull as much as the method which sailors knew and trusted, rum or laudanum. And she was slightly put out by the way he had so immediately shut his journal, as though whatever secrets he had could possibly interest her. For once she decided to let him know her feelings, though she made a great effort to sound good-humoured. "I should sand your latest scribblings, sir, for if your finger slips from holding open the page, they will be rendered unreadable." The feathery eyebrows on his rather fish-like face were raised at what was, regardless of the delivery, nothing short of a direct admonishment, something new from the captain's wife. That would be an interesting observation to add to what he had been writing, which was in the nature of the changes in the crew since the ship first weighed. The journal contained everything he had learnt since coming aboard, part of his study into the workings of a ship and the people who sailed it. Above his head, in a secure locker, were the notebooks which he had filled on a daily basis before transcribing his interpretations into this journal, which would, one day, be the basis of a treatise which would make his name in the circle of savants to which he aspired. In future, those wishing to understand the strange nature of shipboard life and the people who lived it would read Heinrich Lutyens on the subject, and be informed on such diverse matters as reactions to impressment, arbitrary and accepted punishment, the relations between a certain type of officer and the men they led, the tensions that existed in the wardroom, where he ate daily, as well as in the living and sleeping quarters of the crew. Perhaps more interesting was the nature of warship captaincy, with the additional bonus that with his wife aboard, Captain Barclay had added the study of the conjugal relationship between people of very different backgrounds, ages, and perceptions of the world in what was, to say the least, a peculiar setting. "Mr. Coyle, who has the compounded leg fracture, is beyond that screen. I'm sure he will welcome a visit." "Is he in pain?" "Of course, and that will be increased if he moves in any way. The other fellow with the broken arm I sent to help the cook, as even one arm is enough to throw wood into an oven. As you know, the captain does not like men to be idle." It was indeed a strange world to a landsman, and despite his office, Lutyens considered himself to be that, not least in the variety of souls that were contained within the confines of these wooden walls. Every vice was present, and each person was an individual to be studied for their tics and emotions, but more importantly for the subtle changes that emerged as the time spent in the confines of the ship grew. As Emily Barclay went through the screen, he did as she had suggested, opened his journal and sanded the half-dry ink. Then, reflecting on the changes in her, he went back over the observations he had made from the very first time they had met. Such words as shy and tense leapt out at him, and he knew that at the time of writing they had been accurate. Then had come the day when she had stood up to her husband over what she saw as chastisement of an innocent man. From that day on, his observations had told of a changed woman. "Ma'am," said Coyle, seeking to ease himself up from the cot on which he lay, that made more awkward by an attempt to touch his forelock. He was a stocky fellow, with enough scars on his face to hint at a life of hardship. "Please do not bestir yourself, Mr. Coyle. The surgeon was most adamant on that point. I have only come on behalf of my husband to see how you fare." Coyle kept his face bland then, as still as his bad leg, for the notion that Ralph Barclay cared two hoots for his welfare was sheer bollocks, and he feared that might show. That his wife might was possible. He did not know her well enough to say, though she appeared a kindly soul, but he knew his captain both by reputation and experience. If he was respected for being a hard horse, he was not loved, and he had shown on this voyage that he would flog any man who crossed him, even if the offence fell outside the Articles of War. "I must confess to knowing very little of you, Mr. Coyle, which is shameful given the time we have spent at sea. Now I have a chance to make amends. Would it be too much of a strain for you to tell me something of yourself?" Again Coyle had to keep a straight face, for once his leg had been set in splints, and he had rested from a night of deep discomfort, he had suffered a long interrogation by the surgeon. Where he was from, did he have any family, what had brought him into the Navy, where did he expect that such service would take him, all jotted down in one of those little notebooks that Lutyens was never without. Suspicious that the surgeon had the means to withhold relief from pain, Coyle had said more than he normally would to anyone. It was not that he was a secretive man, but life had taught him that it was best to keep what was personal to himself. "Not much to tell, ma'am. I was a soldier before I came to the Navy, which is why I has my rating." Seeing the look of curiosity, he added, "Master-at-arms aboard ship is often an office filled by an ex-soldier, seeing as we know about weapons and their use. But there be precious few tars of my acquaintance who know out about them, which can be mortal should we get into a fight. Half of them I teach are more likely to shoot their foot off than maim an enemy, and as for wielding a cutlass, why, they're more danger to their own." Emily Barclay had come below to comfort Coyle, to ask if he had any family. Would he like her to pen a letter for him, always assuming he lacked the ability to write himself. The idea that came into her head then was sudden and thrilling. "Would you teach me to shoot, Mr. Coyle?" He stirred in surprise, and pain flashed over his face. "You, ma'am?" "Why not? I am told you will be laid up for some time, but you will be capable of some movement." "Shooting muskets ain't for ladies, ma'am." "Why ever not, Mr. Coyle? Am I not aboard a fighting vessel?" "The very idea! Why, Captain Barclay would have my guts at the suggestion." "Mr. Coyle," Emily replied, with a look on her face that brooked no argument, "you must leave the feelings of Captain Barclay to me." It was late afternoon before HMS Brilliant got close enough to make out the state of the French fleet, and what young Mr. Fairmelot, his lookout, saw in the outer roadstead and reported to him made Ralph Barclay content, for the news was promising. The last thing he wanted was to send back a depressing dispatch. Even if he could not be blamed for telling the truth, he knew that the person who delivered bad news in King George's Navy was sometimes somehow tainted by association. There were 24 ships of the line, but none with their yards crossed and ready for sea. In the dockyard, other line of battleships were building or repairing, and Fairmelot was sure that another one, the biggest of them all, was floating in the water of the inner harbour and being fitted out. They came about twice to traverse the harbour entrance, well out of the range of any fortress guns, 42-pounders capable of firing a ball some 2 miles. That they made no attempt to essay the range made the thought of closer observation tempting, but Ralph Barclay surmised they were keeping their powder dry for that very purpose, the hope that he would stray into their deadly orbit. "Vessel making sail in the outer road, sir." "Can you make out what it is, Mr. Fairmelot?" "A frigate, sir, but I cannot see the ports to assess the number of guns as they're hidden by the mole." "Come to chase us off, sir," said Glaister. "Too late for that, I think, Lieutenant. More likely their admiral has a notion that we will engage, and he can take or sink us. That now is the only way to stop us telling the fleet what we have observed." "That tricolor must have fooled them, sir." "Yes. Let's get it down and show them who we are. Then close with Captain Gould while I go below to write my dispatch, and keep me informed of the progress of that ship-making sail." There was no cabin to enter, for everything had been taken down when they cleared for action. The bulkheads that had formed the walls were now either hinged up and fastened to the deck beams, or down below, as was the cabin furniture off which they had eaten their dinner. A chair had been left for his wife to sit on, as he apprehended no immediate danger, and a small desktop escritoire on which he would pen his dispatch, though he had to kneel on the deck planking to do so. His letter was addressed to the man he had last seen in Lisbon Harbour, Vice Admiral Sir William Hotham. HMS Brilliant, at sea off Toulon, July the 28th, 1793. Sir, in pursuance of the orders given to me aboard your flagship, I have the honour to furnish you with the following information about the state of the enemy fleet. He went on to list what had been observed in terms of tonnage, guns, and a guess at preparedness, before concluding, I felt it my duty to send off Captain Gould as soon as practicable, so that you will have information on which you can base a sound judgment. I acknowledge that it is incomplete, but I will endeavour in the following days to secure a more accurate picture of the state of affairs in the port, and a clear idea of the exact state of readiness of the enemy's ability to mount operations prior to the rendezvous I anticipate you will make, here off Toulon, in the coming weeks. I am, sir, your most humble servant. Sanded and sealed, he put the dispatch in an oilskin pouch, then turned to Emily, who had sat silently while he wrote. Now, my dear, you can quit your chair and come on deck, for I believe we will soon have something to show you. A frigate, sir, a 28 just clearing the outer anchorage. Thank you, Mr. Glaister. Fairmelot positively screamed from the masthead. Deck there! "Sail bearing due east!" "Of what nature?" called Glaister, as both he and his captain grabbed a telescope and trained them over the rail. Ralph Barclay positively spat at his first lieutenant, angry at himself for not anticipating what should have been obvious, but quite prepared, in the time-honoured fashion he had observed from his first days at sea, to pass on his ire. "Are you a fool, sir? It'll be a warship, Mr. Glaister. The fastest the French have, set to trap us." Glaister took the rebuke with equanimity, too well versed in the ways of the Navy to protest, indeed composing his face into an attitude of open respect. "You did wonder at it, sir, which is close to anticipation." "I did, Mr. Glaister, you are right." Mollified by the Highlander's tone, Ralph Barclay spoke in a more friendly way. "Though I think, like me, you will observe he may have come too precipitately upon his task. He should have waited until we engaged, or sought to play catch-me with that fellow coming out." "They have the wind, sir." "So do we if we run, Mr. Glaister." The emotion, in the look that crossed his Premier's face, was replicated in the bodily attitude of every officer and midshipman on deck. They saw only the chance of a fight, with the possibility of glory. That it could be madness made no odds, for glory brought with it rewards that could not be gained in any other fashion. It also brought with it the possibility, or in this case the near certainty, of death and destruction. But that was as nothing compared to promotion, public gratitude, and wealth. Ralph Barclay, who scoffed at the kind of captains who indulged in quarterdeck explanations, was obliged to address the matter, though he took care to look at Emily as he did so, for though he cared not one jot that his inferiors might consider him shy, he cared a great deal that she did not. "I am as minded to engage the enemy as the next man, but at odds of 2 to 1 in vessels, and I am sure more in weight of shot, I would not take it at the best of times. This is not such an occasion. We have a duty to the fleet and Admiral Hotham to stay in one piece and to continue to be observant." He turned away from his wife then to give his orders. "Mr. Glaister, bring us about, and order Captain Gould to close so that he can take on board my dispatch. Mr. Collins, I want everything aloft that she will bear. Let's show these French dogs what a British ship can do, well handled, one that will be back off their anchorage a week hence to assess their progress. And rest assured, gentlemen, if we catch one of the enemy alone, we will show him what the Royal Navy can do in a fight." Closing with HMS Firefly so that his dispatch could be transferred, and the subsequent shortening of sail to effect it, slowed down that flight. But Ralph Barclay wasn't bothered by that. The fact that the French ships were closing brought them into view, hull up through a long glass. But before he could do that, he must give his junior his instructions. "Mr. Gould, we shall run due west until nightfall, when I want you to set your course for Gibraltar. You are to proceed with all dispatch, sparing neither wood nor canvas, and keep a lookout for the fact that Admiral Hotham may already have cleared the straits. What you carry is vital to the future success of our nation's arms." Having delivered what he thought a rousing little homily, he took up a telescope and began to study his putative enemies. Carefully he noted the distinguishing nature of each vessel, sail plan, figureheads, how she lay on the wind, as well as manner in which they were handled, which was the swiftest, making many a mental note that would come into play should he meet any of them again. Finally, aware that the whole of his crew were merely waiting for the order, he gave the command to set all sail. That occasioned another shaft of pleasure, for his men were now fully worked up so that the task of setting the sails, once a noisy mayhem, was now smooth and carried out in relative quiet, with only spoken commands and the boatswain's various pipes being required to complete the whole in very short order, as they headed towards the setting sun, sitting in the diminishing wake of HMS Firefly. Chapter 3. If John Pearce's interview with Admiral Graves had gone badly, that was as nothing to the one he sought to have with Lord Howe. Having, at a rate of 8 pence a mile, taken a post-chaise all the way to Bath, he found that the old Admiral had surrounded himself, in the form of clerks and aides, with a carapace of protection that would have done justice to an Eastern potentate. Only official dispatches from the Admiralty, or those from his inferior admirals in Portsmouth, were allowed to disturb his days of eating, drinking, taking the restorative waters in the old Roman baths, and playing cards in the pump-room. A plea that the liberty of the king's subjects was at stake got Pearce precisely nowhere. A demand that a promise made required fulfilment also fell on deaf ears, with the addition of a stinging rebuke for presumption thrown in from a member of his protective screen. "When will the Admiral go back to Portsmouth?" "When the French make it necessary he should do so. Now be gone." There were two other possibilities, people who might intercede on behalf of his pelicans: the Admiralty itself, and William Pitt, the King's First Minister, who had offered his help in the matter of a place should he need it, though he had no certainty what it would be worth as a promise, any more than that of how. He was even more doubtful about it being extended to an entirely different matter, such as the fate of illegally pressed seamen. Even with time being of the essence, that required a careful assessment of his funds, money borrowed from his wealthy paramour, for he could not afford another post-chaise all the way to London. A compromise was called for: speed to Marlborough, then a slower mode of transport, a stagecoach from there to Charing Cross. This by a man who was cursing himself for not buying a horse. Both in post-chaise and stagecoach he was mostly uncommunicative with his fellow passengers, alone with his own thoughts, none of which were pleasant, declining to even discuss the latest news from Paris, which was that the firebrand revolutionary Marat had been murdered in his bath. As he listened to this being discussed, he did feel the temptation to intervene when opinions composed of arrant nonsense were being advanced, for he knew the man through his father. The dwarfish Marat had been one of the people who had originally welcomed Adam Pearce to Paris, lauding him as a true son of the Revolution, who had fallen foul of his own government merely for his expressed and printed opinions. That welcome had not lasted. The leaders of the Revolution had no more time for an honest radical speaker than King George and his ministers. Marat was a prime example of the breed. The scrofulous troublemaker couldn't resist the notion of being behind the mob. Like so many of the Paris enragés, he wanted to be ahead of them, leading them on to further excess and murder. To John Pearce's mind, he deserved to die in such an ignominious way, given that he had demanded, through the pages of his journal, L'Ami du Peuple, death for so many others. The trouble was that in thinking about Marat he could not avoid ruminating on other things. Though he knew it to be pointless, he could not help but go over what had happened in Paris, gnawing at the notion that by some act unspecified he could have changed the outcome and saved his father's life. To force himself away from those thoughts only brought Pearce back to why he was in this damned conveyance in the first place, his own utter unreliability. And that led in turn to gloomy reflections on his future prospects, which were not dazzling, given that his upbringing, while making him an independent soul, had ill-prepared him for anything like a career. The one occupation that was definitely out of the question was that he should follow in his father's footsteps and become a radical speaker and pamphleteer, a scourge of the powerful and titled. What had been much sought after in the year 89, after the fall of the Bastille, was not welcome now. After 4 years, the mood of the nation was almost wholly set against change, having seen from across the Channel what happens when the props which a polity needed to exist were removed. Worse than that, he had no other real skill that he could think of to turn to. An ability to ride, to fence, a superficial knowledge of the classics and fluent French, plus reasonably polished manners, seemed to be either in abundant supply or not at present required outside the possibility of becoming a schoolmaster. That was an idea he abhorred, just like the army, which anyway he could not afford. A commission cost too much. None of it mattered anyway, not until he fulfilled the purpose of the journey he was now on. Arrival in London and the prospect of a warm and affectionate welcome provided another disappointment, as a rather arch footman at the Fitzherbert London townhouse informed him that her ladyship had left for the country, having sent the few possessions he owned to be stored at Nerot's Hotel in King Street to await his return. A letter that had arrived had been forwarded there as well, for which he owed the household payment of 6, since it had come express. Standing on the stoop, for he was not allowed into the house, Pearce was aware that the footman, obsequious less than a week before, less so now, could be lying. Annabel might well be at home, or at least in London, but he was also acutely aware of the fact that he could do nothing about it. Had he been but a dalliance for a rich and titled lady who had taken a fancy to a young, handsome and heroic sailor? Directions supplied, it was a slow walk through the streets again, once more contemplating failure, ignoring hucksters, lottery ticket vendors and entertainers, plus the dozens of beggars, some children, many limbless, that either accosted or called to him for succour. This while the sedan chairs of those who were wealthy enough to pay jogged by at speed, weaving through the tradesmen's carts and the coaches of the truly wealthy, which set up a cacophony of noise as iron-rimmed wheels rattled over the uneven cobblestones. Recalling Peg Bamber's words about London being a hateful place, at this moment he had an inclination to agree. Chokingly full of smoke in winter, when some of these beggars would freeze to death, it could be like a cauldron in summer, when the smell of rotting rubbish, human waste, and the decomposing flesh, both human and animal, attacked the senses. But all cities were the same. If anything, Paris was commonly worse, with a nosegay an obligatory object when the temperature rose, even indoors. That peripatetic life, when growing up, had given Pearce a love of fresh air and open spaces, even of clean sea breezes. Indeed, there had been moments aboard ship when the weather was clement and the work satisfying that he had enjoyed the experience, moments when he could forget how it was he had got there. To enter Nerot's hotel was to put that behind him. Double doors snuffed out the noise, while the smell of scented candles and the beeswax polish of floor and furniture took away the exterior stench. There were well-upholstered settles in the lobby, and deep armchairs, even a fire in the grate for those who had no notion that it was a warm day outside. It was not all pleasant. The hotel clerk who received guests was even more condescending than the footman who had opened the door to him at Lady Annabel's. He wrinkled his nose and pointedly cast an eye at Pearce's boots, which had upon them the filth, in the form of mud, manure, and the odd bit of straw, that came from walking through the streets of the capital. Name given, a letter was produced, which had on it the easily recognized seal of the Admiralty. "Will Sir be requiring a room?" "If I do," thought Pearce, aware of how the travel to Bath and back to London had nearly cleaned him out, "it will be in a debtor's prison." But such a depressing thought was quickly followed by the next, that he needed to do something to get help, and the only two sources he could think of who could provide that were close by. Letters from Nerot's would imply a standing he in truth did not possess, which could only aid his cause. As for the cost, John Pearce was subject to more than one devil that he had inherited from his father, for Adam Pearce had never let a lack of funds interfere with the need to lay his own head and that of his son on a decent pillow, sure that the next day a good and rousing speech, and the hat passed round, would provide the money to meet the bill. "I shall." The clerk, with a haughty expression, looked at the small valise with which this guest had arrived, and sniffed again, though this time disdainfully, an expression repeated when Pearce informed him that he had some luggage already stored here, for unbeknown to him the clerk recalled the arrival of an extremely old and battered trunk, which the storekeeper had made a point of telling him was almost empty. This was clearly no well-heeled prospect, a point of which Pearce was well aware. Normally modest, he knew he had to say something to avoid being politely shown the door. "You will have no doubt heard, sir, of the recent taking of the French ship of the line, the Valmy." "Who has not, sir? A most inspiring event," opined the clerk, with a tone that almost implied his own involvement. "The nation has once again shown the glorious abilities of our wooden walls." Try as he might, having finished speaking, he could not hide a degree of curiosity. "And a very valuable prize, I dare say. Am I to understand that you were part of that action, sir?" His own chest puffed out, and speaking in a tone he would have despised in another, Pearce replied, "Part of it, sir? I can tell you that without me no success would have been possible. Indeed, King George himself, when I was called up to attend his levee at Windsor, made that very connection." The words king and levee were accompanied by a clicking of fingers, as the now smiling clerk summoned a porter in striped waistcoat and leather apron. A heavy key was produced, and an instruction whispered, whereupon the porter lifted the small valise with a care that suggested it contained the whole prize fund for the French warship, and headed for the thickly carpeted stairs. The clerk indicated that Pearce should follow with the words, "I hope you enjoy your stay with us, sir. 'Tis most uplifting to have a hero under our rafters, and one who will garner a fine reward for his sterling efforts." Wondering if the word sterling was a pun on money, Pearce made for the staircase. The porter had waited for him. The paucity of the luggage and the notion that he was dealing with a well-heeled champion of the nation's arms had no doubt inspired his excessive garrulousness. He seemed eager to inform Pearce that the room he had been allotted was one normally reserved for folk of real quality. "Fit for an admiral, your honour, and why not, if it be fit for a duke or an earl? Why, I've had folk in there, sir, who have needed a dozen local beds just for accommodation of their servants." Pearce was shown into a comfortable sitting-room with tall windows, all armchairs and settles, with a bedroom attached, while the porter made a great play of carefully placing his valise by the washstand, talking all the while in an ingratiating manner. Well versed in the art of extracting a tip from his guests, he then stood and waited for this new one to oblige. He was even practised enough to hold the smile on his face when he felt the paucity of what had been placed in his hand, bowing slightly as he informed John Pearce that he would fetch his luggage from the basement storeroom in a trice. "I shall be back in a jiff, your honour, and I dare say you would like to remove them boots and have them cleaned, as well as welcome some jugs of piping water fetched for a bath." Grubby from travel, that was a very welcome idea. "Thank you." "And wine, sir, you will be partaking of some wine. The hotel does a fine ordinary claret, of which I'm happy to say we have a good supply. Not that it will be long before that is back on tap. Those madmen has taken to murdering each other now, though I will add that you'll be safer in your bath than that sod Mirat." Too embarrassed to refuse, and too disinterested to correct his misnaming of Marat, Pearce just nodded. "I need writing materials." "In the bureau, sir. Paper, quills, and a knife to sharpen them, as well as fine sand. I shall fetch a candle, sir, for the wax." The porter departed, the face outside the door less pleasant as he contemplated the 2 pieces of copper in his hand. For he was a man accustomed to silver at the very least, and in the case of proper folk, with a rate of servants, the odd half-guinea. In the basement he moaned to the storekeeper that this new fellow was no gent, but that Ezekiel Didcot knew how to get his due. "And I shall, be it in dribs and drabs of copper, I shall get my due." Didcot had left John Pearce wondering how he was going to pay for this, or rather how he could avoid payment, for he knew he lacked the means for such accommodation. Matters were not improved by his missive from the Admiralty. His lieutenant's commission, along with a bill for 11 shillings and 8 pence due to the clerk who had drawn it up, to be paid at his earliest convenience. The enclosure also informed him that he needed to attend the building to swear allegiance to the king, his heirs and successors, as well as the need to confirm that he was not of the proscribed Catholic faith, this ensured by his acceptance of the 39 articles of the Protestant religion. By the time he had contemplated those and decided they could be safely ignored, Didcot was back with claret and biscuits, followed by a row of servants with a bath and jugs of hot water, that soon transferred, and another bearing a battered old trunk. They departed, but Didcot did not, talking incessantly, which occasioned another raid on the guests' rapidly diminishing funds to see the porter out the door, backing out with the words, "A warming pan for the bed, your honour." "No!" Pearce snapped, closing the door. A muffled demand came through the panelling. "And dinner, sir?" "I'll be eating out." There was a short letter from Annabel Fitzgerald in the trunk, which managed to be affectionate and distant in the same set of sentences, alluding to the pleasure they had taken in each other's company, while making it plain, without saying as much, that it was now in the past. There was no invitation to call, merely a reference to the fact that, given his fame and the way he was certain to be lionized, they would be bound to meet at those places frequented by those who moved in the best social circles. "My dear lady," he said quietly to himself, "I suspect society is just as fickle as you. They will have forgotten the Valmy in a week or 2. Pearce stripped off and lowered himself gratefully into the bath. But he did not linger, for to do so only produced ruminations on his predicament, none of which was comfortable. As soon as he was clean, he was out and dried, and into the clean clothing he found in the trunk. Then, taking the fine-headed notepaper from the desk drawer and sharpening a quill, he dipped his pen and began to write. The hotel had provided wax and its own seal, which he used to secure the letters. He had to wait a while until his boots were returned, which obliged him to ignore the knocking on the door and wait till Didcot left them. As soon as the porter was gone, he had them on and went down the stairs and out through the lobby like a man with much on his mind. The delivery of his letters by a postboy he managed for a penny, the addresses of the Admiralty and Downing Street being almost next door to each other, both also destinations that would not pay for the carriage. Taking a seat in the tavern from which he had engaged the boy, he ate a filling pie washed down with a very pleasant tankard of porter for a tenth of the price he would have paid at Nerot's, ruminating as he did so on what his missives would achieve. He had no faith that the letter to the secretary at the Admiralty would produce anything, and pinned what little hope he had on that he had sent to William Pitt, requesting an interview. An hour later he turned up at the front door of His Majesty's First Lord of the Treasury, and was shown into an anteroom to wait, offered a glass of wine, which he declined, something he came to regret as 1 hour stretched to 2, then 3, and more, so that it was nearing 10 of the clock before he was ushered into Pitt's presence. Slim, pale, and still looking absurdly young for his office, William Pitt sat at a large table which seemed to fill most of a spacious room. With him was a solid, well-fed-looking and florid fellow, and on the table the papers they had been going through, as well as several empty claret bottles, which they appeared to have consumed while doing so. "Lieutenant Pearce, if I am not mistaken." "He's drunk," thought Pearce, looking at the bottles and catching the slur in the voice. "Allow me to name you a fellow countryman of yours, Henry Dundas." "Laddie," Dundas said, using a diminutive, and in a deep Scottish-accented voice that was very reminiscent of his father. "I knew old Adam well, sir, having crossed swords with him, verbally, of course, many times. I commiserate with you in your loss, and damn, as sure as I am you do, the villains who did such a thing." Dundas, too, had had a drink, and it was in the high colour of his cheeks, but seemed less affected by it than Pitt. "We shall have to be about our business, Will. We are due in the house at this very moment." "Then we will need a couple to help us through, Henry, so pull the bell for more. Will you join us in a glass, young Pearce?" "No, thank you, sir. If time is pressing, so is my business." "Which is?" "I believe when we last met I alluded to the fact that I was illegally pressed into the Navy." "Did you? I do not recall." "Along with several other unfortunates. Indeed, I hope one day to see the captain involved, one Ralph Barclay, in court for the offence." Dundas cut in, speaking from the side of the great fireplace, in the act of tugging on a bell-pull. "I wouldn't have pinned too much faith in a satisfactory outcome of something like that, laddie. We are at war, did you no ken?" "Careful, Harry," Pitt cut in with a lopsided smile. "Your laddie is a proven fighter." Pearce replied to Dundas, "And we, sir, I believe, have laws that war does not suspend." "One or two of which I ken you and your late father were wont to break, to the point of both prison and flight. Sedition, was it not? Scurrilous writings saying that what happened to King Louis should have been repeated in the case of our Geordie." The smile that accompanied those words had an undertone of menace, as Pearce recalled his father's opinion of Henry Dundas, which was not a high or flattering one. Called the uncrowned King of Scotland, he was the leader of a large group of Scottish MPs, a staunch supporter of Pitt and his government, and so skilled in jobbery and corruption that his name was wont to produce apoplexy in those who opposed him, which included a goodly number of fellow Tories. Pearce also knew the pamphlet to which Dundas was referring had called for the peaceful removal of the king, an abolition of the monarchy, having been written long before King Louis's execution. Adam Pearce would never have proposed decapitation for any human being, even a tyrant. But there was no point in saying so, for if time was pressing, there was no time to debate the rights and wrongs of republicanism. "Be that as it may, Mr. Dundas, I have several companions still illegally forced to serve in the Navy. Admiral Lord Howe promised to release them and has not done so. I tried to get him to act in Bath, but I failed to even get to see him." "An indolent fellow," said Pitt, reaching for a half-full bottle and filling his glass. "Only the insistence of the King secured his appointment. But then the King did the same for you when he demanded your promotion, did he not? So we must not complain." A servant entered and placed 2 bottles on the table, this while Pitt emptied into his mouth what he had just poured. The corks had been removed, then replaced so that they were proud of the neck. "I need your assistance to get them released, Mr. Pitt." "That's coming it a wee bit high, is it not, laddie, importuning the King's First Minister for such a paltry purpose?" "It may be paltry to you, Mr. Dundas, but to me it is important." The shrug that he received in response was eloquent enough. What was important to Pearce was not important to men such as these. "We must go, Will, or Fox will start debating the West Indian situation without us. Much hangs on it." Pearce spoke to Pitt in desperation, for he suspected that if he failed in this interview he would struggle to get another. What he said was impulsive, but it was the only thing he could think of. "Sir, at the King's levee you promised me if you could ever be of service to me I was to call upon you. I do so now." It was Dundas who replied, leaving Pearce to wonder who held the power in the room. "It is beyond our office to interfere in the business of the Navy, laddie. Lord Chatham and the sea officers of the Board of Admiralty would quite rightly tell us to poke our noses elsewhere, and the serving sailors would be a damn sight less polite." "Then give me the means to free them myself." "How can I do that?" slurred Pitt. "I have a lieutenant's commission. Get me a place on a vessel going to the Mediterranean, for that is where these companions of mine are headed." "Well." "Quite," the First Lord of the Treasury replied, nodding to Dundas and hauling himself slowly to his feet to stand swaying ever so slightly. "If I made such a promise, then I shall redeem it, for I would not have it said that I am not a man of my word. Leave a letter with one of my secretaries, tell me what you need and where you are to be found, and I will see what I can do." "A letter from you demanding their release would carry much weight." The tone of Pitt's voice had a harder edge than hitherto. "I seem to recall I am obliged to you for one favour, Mr. Pearce, not 2. "Be so good as to be off, Pearce," insisted Dundas, "for if we dinna attend the hoose, those damned Whigs might try to force a vote." Pearce bit his tongue then, holding back the desire to know how 2 men as inebriated as these could possibly engage in debate. Had he seen them enter the chamber later, each with a bottle in hand and their arms around each other for mutual support, he would have wondered even more. But then a look at both the government and the opposition benches, and the sound of the raucous and uncontrolled cheers and jeers which greeted their arrival, would have established that the 2 men, as far as being drunk was concerned, were in good company. Chapter 4. His first call the following morning was to the Admiralty, where he faced, for the first time in his life, the creatures who guarded access to the building, the uniformed doormen. Unbeknown to this visitor, they were notorious throughout the Navy, well-remunerated fellows who could barely be brought to civility by the arrival of an admiral, were generally indifferent to post-captains, hardly surprising given they were better paid, so that their attitude to lieutenants was nothing short of rude. "Can't do any oath-swearing today, they be holding their levee," insisted one, a gnarled-faced gnome who smelt strongly of stale beer and tobacco. "Come back tomorrow." "I was not aware they held such a thing." "I dare say there be a rate of things you don't know, young fella, which ain't much use when you's at sea. Happens one day every week, and if you ain't got a written invite, you can't pass through this door." There were 2 things of which John Pearce, looking at this pair, was sure: that no amount of pleading would help, and that he lacked the only other thing, money, which might get him inside. So he mentioned that which he had posted yesterday,
You sent in a letter, you say?
I did, Pearce replied, to the first secretary.
Why, I suspect he's a-reading it now, young sir, and wondering what he did to deserve your condescension.
The other doorman wheezed out a laugh, proving to Pearce the thought which had already occurred, that he was being toyed with. All I want to know is if it has been received and read.
Has you any notion of waiting for a reply?
I do not have time to wait. Nor, thought Pearce, do I want to part with a sixpence to read it.
Hear that, Alfred? Our young pup has no time to wait. I reckon the Frenchies will be quaking in their boots to know this lad's a-coming to do battle with 'em.
The other fellow was looking over his shoulder at the busy Whitehall traffic.
Well, he'd best be off to his fight, for we've got no time to indulge him. I suggest that you move along, for I see Captain Ord approaching, who is on the list of invites, and we has no mind to keep him waiting for the likes of you.
It was only curiosity that kept Pearce there until this officer was greeted and passed inside, that and a feeling of certainty that he would witness what he did, the passing of coin from this Captain Ord to the two now utterly obsequious, forelock-tugging doormen, which only served to underline his need for money. His next call was to see about getting some.
"Mr. Davidson will see you now, Lieutenant."
Pearce rose from the chair which he had occupied this last half-hour and followed the fellow who had summoned him into a large office, leaving behind him an impressive bustle of activity, of the kind that convinced him that he was about to deal with a serious man of business, for he had been listed in the newspapers as the agent handling the prize fund due from the capture of the Valmy. The first thing that struck him about Davidson's appearance was his apparent youthfulness. Such an enterprise as the one he had observed surely should have someone of more age and gravity at its head. Yet the smile was disarming, the welcome genuine on a young, attractive face. But the news the prize agent had to impart, once he had identified himself and where he came from, was far from encouraging, all hinging on the fact that the French 74 had been taken through the efforts of 2 vessels with 2 commanders. "I represent Captain Marchand of HMS Centurion, while your superior officer, Mr. Colborne, is represented by the company of Omani and Druce. It is they who have questioned the distribution, which has a share allotted to Mr. Colborne as being that of a lieutenant instead of as a captain." Pearce knew all about that dispute, and the way he had referred to Marchand by his post-rank while calling Colborne a mere mister was revealing. Davidson was far from being a non-partisan representative. "He was captain of the Griffin," Pearce insisted. "Master and commander at a stretch, though an armed cutter does not carry the rank, Mr. Pearce, but not made post and on the captain's list. You must understand, to acknowledge that Lieutenant Colborne, as he was at the time of the capture, shares in a captain's rank and entitlements would cost Captain Marchand several £1,000s. At present, since Captain Marchand was under Admiralty orders, he has 3/8 of the total, with no commanding admiral to satisfy. Were he to accede to Mr. Colborne's demands, half of that would be forfeit, and the complications of dealing with the senior officer who wrote out orders for HMS Griffin would just add another layer of difficulty." Pearce knew that whatever the arguments, they had no effect on him except delay. His share would be fixed whatever the outcome of the dispute. "How long before it is decided?" "A piece of rope is a fair guide," Davidson replied with an almost embarrassed shrug. "Lawyers do not rush in these matters. I have known such cases take years to resolve." "I need money now." Seeing the inquiring look, he decided not to mention Nerot's hotel, which had provided him with a good night's sleep, and that morning with a sturdy breakfast. But he had no trouble thinking of a reason that would make sense to the man on the other side of the desk, even if it was a stretching of the truth. "I have expectations of a place, and I need to buy the necessities an officer requires for sea service. Everything I owned went down with the ship." "You were a midshipman, my clerk informed me." Davidson smiled as Pearce nodded, with a clear air of sympathy. "I fear a mid's cut will scarce suffice to provide for the whole of your needs, sir." "It will go some way to offsetting the costs," Pearce replied, without certainty, for he had no real idea of what he needed to go to sea, only that he might require money to pay for his commission and, more pressingly, his hotel. "I have advanced money to those members of the Centurion's crew who requested it, but I'm obliged to do so at a discount which reflects the burden I have to carry in advancing sums for which I have no sure date for redemption. Offset, no doubt, by the interest you will earn." Davidson was quite sharp then. "You will have seen, while waiting, that I carry substantial overheads which must be met somehow." "How much would I be due in those circumstances?" Davidson reached behind him for a large and weighty ledger, thumped it onto the table, and smiled at Pearce before opening it. Running his finger down a column of figures, Davidson's brow furrowed. He went to another and did the same until he eventually stopped. "Pearce, did you say?" "Yes." "I'm afraid I have you listed as a landsman, Mr. Pearce. Scarce credible given the uniform you're wearing." The reply carried all the tension Pearce felt. "Captain Colborne rated me a midshipman." "Not apparently in the last muster book he sent in, from which I take my figures. You have something in writing to that effect?" "No." "And it is to be assumed that the last books went down with the ship?" As Pearce nodded, he tapped the ledger. "Then, unless you can produce some proof, I cannot do other than take from this. Mr. Colborne can, of course, change it with the consent of the other party." Seeing the look on Pearce's face, he added, "I can write to him asking for clarification." Pearce was thinking hard, sure that the last submission of Griffin's muster book had been after his elevation, because Colborne had been adamant he would not get any pay for a rank that officially carried none. In fact, it only mattered in the issue of prize money. Their relationship had been far from good. In truth, at times it had been downright hostile. Had the man merely not bothered, or had he humbugged him, as he had done more than once before? "Would it be possible to draw what I am owed and still seek the rest once my rank has been established?" Davidson nodded again. "It is not a sum to excite, I must say, but we are dealing with the crews of 2 vessels, and I must say your Griffin was heavily manned for her size." "A figure, if you please, sir." Davidson shuffled some papers in a drawer, finally producing a sheaf to be studied. "The whole prize is valued at just over £23,000, and a landsman share comes in at just above 20 guineas. I could advance you the sum of £16 with safety." "Can I ask what Captain Marchand will receive?" Davidson had the good grace to look slightly uncomfortable. He was a man unaccustomed to having in his office those on the lowest rung of the prize fund ladder, the common seamen, and was therefore unused to trying to explain a system so manifestly unfair. "It is a sum you can calculate for yourself, Lieutenant. Should his case be found to be correct, and given he was sailing under Admiralty orders, so there is no commanding officer to share his good fortune, he will receive over £8,000, less, of course, his legal fees and my commissions. If Mr. Colborne is successful in his suit, that will be halved." "I have heard sailors curse the system of distribution of prize money. Now I know them to be right in their condemnation." "There are many sailors, sir, but only one captain." "Have any of the Griffins applied for advance payment?" Davidson looked down at the ledger to check. "Not a one, and nor has Mr. Colborne applied on their behalf." Hardly surprising, Pearce thought. The poor sods are trapped on another ship, and I doubt Colborne cares 2 hoots about them. "What you offer is not enough to meet my needs." "Then, sir," Davidson replied gravely, "you must act as do other naval officers and pledge your pay as credit. Those who supply the Navy are accustomed to accept such sureties in lieu of settlement." Davidson actually laughed then, not very much, but enough. "Damn me, sir. Without that sort of credit, we would scarce have a man able to serve. Even admirals are accustomed to pawning their plate or borrowing in order to take up their duties." The money was paid out by a clerk, and it was a ruminative John Pearce, mentally composing a stiff letter to his previous commander on the subject of his rank, who walked back to the hotel, there to find a letter waiting for him bearing an impressive Royal Treasury seal and franked as government post. It was clear, as it was handed over, that he was not the only one to be astounded. The hotel clerk who gave it to him had learned how to grovel somewhat to a man who clearly had the ear of those in power. He waited till he was alone in his room to read it. "Lieutenant Pearce, I am on reflection conscious of the commitment I made to you at Windsor, and with that in mind I have made representations to my brother regarding your needs, unfortunately to no avail. You will understand that at present, as the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Chatham is inundated with requests for employment from extremely deserving officers with exemplary service records, submissions he is often obliged to decline for a lack of an available place. To ask him to elevate your claim above theirs would be grossly unfair. Having read the letter you left with my secretary, I am unsure of your purpose. Is your primary concern the release of those companions you claim were, like you, illegally pressed into the Navy and now en route to serve in the Mediterranean? Or is it that you seek employment for yourself?" Recalling what he had penned the night before, Pearce was sure that he had made plain what he sought, both verbally and in writing. He had, as a backstop, asked for a place if that would provide the only avenue open to him to help his friends. "While I cannot comment on the merits of your case, I can see that the proper place to make representations on their behalf would be to Lord Hood, the Commander-in-Chief on that station, who, as the senior naval member serving on the Board of Admiralty, might also be in a position to adjudicate on your assertions of improper behaviour on the part of an officer presently serving under his command. It would also be the case that, should you seek an opening, Lord Hood, as a serving C&C on active service, would be in a better position to offer you employment than even my own brother. With that in mind, and in the hope that it will satisfy you, I have arranged for you to take passage on the packet carrying official dispatches for Lord Hood, which sails, weather permitting, from Portsmouth every 7 days. There is also private correspondence of a confidential nature which you must undertake to carry, along with a recommendation from me regarding the granting to you of a place suitable to your abilities, which I can say with some confidence should have the desired effect. If Lord Hood can oblige me, given that he is a stout supporter of my government, owing as he does his position as a serving member on the Board of Admiralty to me, he will undoubtedly do so. If you agree, please send the enclosed pre-franked note by return, the information in which I will pass on to the First Secretary at the Admiralty, who can then have drawn up the requisite official instructions. Should you accept the offer contained herein, I consider, as I am sure you do, that my obligation to you is satisfied in all respects. I am—" William Pitt had signed it with a flourish, affixing his official seal and a ribbon inside as well. The blank letter mentioned was indeed enclosed, that too government-franked and thus free to both sender and recipient. Rereading the letter, John Pearce was more conscious of the problems such an offer could create rather than the opportunities. To take passage on that packet was to take a journey into the unknown. He had no real idea how close what was proposed would take him to those he was committed to get free, nor how the man in charge would respond. Hood could tell him to go to the devil in very much the same way as at Admiral Graves. What would he do then? And what about the request that he be found employment, a course fraught with peril? He might be a lieutenant, or would be once he had sworn the requisite oaths and paid his fee, but he had little knowledge of how to undertake the duties that went with the rank. The notion that he might be reluctantly forced to follow that course brought home to him another fact. As he had pointed out to Davidson, he lacked the means to equip himself with the clothing and equipment necessary to even look the part. And look the part he must, if he was to have the slightest chance of achieving his aim. The faces of his friends came into his mind, as well as the promise he had made them. Pitt had met his obligation. Surely he, John Pearce, could do no less. And if he was required to pretend to be that which he was not, so be it. He must prepare for every eventuality. But how to fund such a thing? The face that replaced those of Michael, Charlie, and Rufus was that of the clerk who had handed him Pitt's letter. The man now thought him superbly well connected, and probably copper-bottomed as far as capital was concerned, with a huge tranche of prize money coming his way. He knew he must play to that, so, moving to the door, he rang the levered bell that would summon Didcot, and when the man came, taking care to tip him with a shilling, Pearce had him send out to a series of naval outfitters, requesting that they attend upon him at the hotel, where he would kit himself out for his journey. Within 24 hours he had ordered his 24 linen shirts, a working hat and a coat to go with the dress one he already owned, and he had chosen a brass-edged sea-chest to contain it all, with the initials Lieutenant J.P. to be burned into it by the local blacksmith, then gilded by a limner. There were 3 pairs of shoes, 1 dress with silver-plated buckles, boots for going ashore, and an everyday pair of pumps that would not damage the deck planking, breeches and a raft of silk stockings, small clothes, handkerchiefs, a boat cloak, a comforter for his neck, oilskins and a foul-weather hat, a medicine box and a vanity one with combs, a mirror, and, last but not least, a proper dress sword, all fitted under the personal supervision of one of the senior outfitting partners, who had no doubt taken care to check with the hotel that this customer could be relied upon to meet his obligations.
"Your goods to be delivered here, sir?"
No. Send them and the chest straight down to Portsmouth, with instructions that they are to be taken to the Pig and Whistle tavern owned by a Mrs. Peg Bamber, near Portsmouth Point. The quizzical expression on the man's face spoke volumes, and Pearce had to steel himself to sound languid as he sought to justify such a destination, which was, quite decidedly, not one of the port's best. The Point at Portsmouth, crowded with drinking dens and hard by the beach on which were drawn up the local boats, was notorious throughout the land for drunken behaviour and licentiousness. But he did not know the name of another establishment, and he could hardly ask.
"I am hoist upon a promise I made some time ago, sir, to a warm-hearted naval widow, never to reside anywhere else should I be in Portsmouth. If you knew the lady, you would also know why it would be an unwise undertaking to break. I dare say the drovers will know where it is. And the account, sir?"
Pearce could not look the fellow in the eye as he replied, "Just send that here. I shall not be leaving London for several weeks." Having seen the chest taken away, he made a point of visiting the blacksmith who had burned in his lettering, even going to the trouble of delivering it back to the outfitters, and paid him in cash for his work and that of the limner who had gilded it, for he could not in all conscience fail to meet his obligations to the 2 working men. Back at Nerot's he sat down and wrote 2 notes, one to Didcot, who could probably read, the other to be handed into the front desk, which simply told them he was vacating the room and that the bill, along with any others due, as well as Lady Annabel's old battered chest, should be sent to him via the Admiralty. These he left propped on the bureau. The last thing he did was retrieve from that old chest a small tin which, thanks to a tight seal, had not suffered from water penetration when he had been forced to swim from the fight with the Valmy. Pearce opened it, smelling once more the earth it contained, taken from a Paris churchyard in which he had watched his father interred. One day he would go back to that place and see if the request he had made that a headstone be provided had been met. Perhaps, in a time of peace, he could have his father's remains disinterred and taken back to Edinburgh for burial in his native city, and maybe even he would tell the truth about his death, that, a sick man who suspected he was dying, he had put himself in place of another marked for execution. Until then, this earth would remind him of that which had caused his father's death, whatever name he chose to expire under, the curse of a French Revolution that had gone from high hopes to chaos, would remind him of his aim to see those who had taken it in that direction brought down. There was nothing else he wanted from that chest. The outer garments were those in which he had come ashore after the battle, cleaned, of course, but still shabby. Second-hand and ill-fitting when purchased, they also bore the faded marks of that engagement, including the blood of friends and foes and immersion in seawater. Ordering a sedan chair to take him to Whitehall, and leaving behind him most of the things with which he had arrived, he departed the hotel, sword at his waist, heading for the Admiralty and the swearing of a series of oaths of which, like his father before him, he was deeply sceptical. With no time to waste, he tipped the doormen 2 shillings, which he soon learned from the growling acceptance was not much more than the bare minimum they expected, just enough to get him into the building. That was followed by a long wait in a warm and crowded anteroom, till the necessary official could be found to administer the pledges of loyalty to Crown and religion. That completed, and the requisite fees paid, he was given his orders, which were to proceed with all dispatch to join the packet preparing to sail from Portsmouth. His next port of call was again at Downing Street. Directed to the office of Pitt's secretary, he was given a thick oilskin pouch with instructions, gravely imparted, that it was to be delivered into the hands of Lord Hood and him alone. He was then, to his surprise, directed into a government carriage for the journey. Chapter 5.
Well, O'Hagan, I had you beat there for a moment. Indeed, I had written off my wagered guineas. But the way you rallied in the last 3 minutes was magnificent. Mr. Taberley.
Michael replied to the officer, though not with any clarity, for his lips were swollen and his jaw aching from the numerous punches it had been forced to absorb, and even the nod of the head occasioned a degree of pain. He winced as Charlie Taverner pressed an alcohol-soaked piece of tow onto his cheek, a cloth which came away carrying traces of red. Rufus Dommett stood by with a bucket of sea-water, said by many to be efficacious in the article of flesh wounds, though the squeamish youngster showed a marked reluctance to wash the streaks of blood off his friend's back, arms, and chest. The opponent in the fight, a barrel of a fellow called Clype, had been a very tough customer indeed, a real long-serving naval hard bargain, immune to the kind of fighting wiles that were Michael's trademark way of winning a scrap. Clype was the kind of man who ignored such subterfuge, who stood up rock-solid to the heaviest blows, so it had therefore come down to a contest of sheer determination not to give in, a toe-to-toe slugging match. Taberley, the lieutenant in charge of his division, had been the only officer aboard HMS Leander to back him. All the others, commissioned and warrant on the 74-gun ship, had gone for the other man, who had a reputation which made him well worth a wager. Thus the odds the lieutenant had managed to extract were showing him a handsome return. With crew it was mostly not money, but grog and tobacco that was used to bet. Few of the original crew had any coin after weeks spent at anchor in Spithead, and the Griffins had been fetched aboard without being paid.
I will see you are rewarded once I've collected my winnings, O'Hagan. There's a couple of gold coins coming your way, and I have the power to excuse you from duties for a few days to recover. See the surgeon, if he's sober, and you feel the need, and if the sot seeks to charge you for palliatives and the like, I will pay.
Taberley probably thought that Michael dropped his head in gratitude, but in fact he had done it so that the officer would not see the anger in his eyes, the desire to do to him what he had done to Clype, whose partisans were around him trying to revive the poor sod. Charlie, who knew only too well what the Irishman was thinking, for he talked enough about it beforehand, dabbed harder with his piece of spirit-soaked tow than he should, which got him a curse in the Erse tongue. But he had done it for the best, for they had seen the grating rigged from the first day of coming aboard this ship, and Charlie knew that half the floggings witnessed had come from acts of common seamen talking without due respect to their officers. The fight need never have happened. Sure, he and Clype had eyed each other on first acquaintance, as those of a certain ability with their fists always do, but the man was no more of a fool than his Irish counterpart. Michael was big and broad of shoulder, and had the air of confidence that went with skill. Clype could see an opponent that would hurt him, even if he was the victor in a contest, and with the wisdom of someone with nothing to prove, he had been warily friendly. But those denizens of the wardroom, led by the Premier, who, without exception, seemed to take pleasure in seeing a man flogged, had grown disputatious regarding the abilities of certain crew members. One of the marine lieutenants knew Clype from a previous commission, and the man had a reputation enough to suggest that none could stand against him. It had been Tabley who had demurred, and suggested that there might be another aboard, in his very own division, who could more than hold his own. After only 14 days at sea, and not so much as a sniff of a sail, friend or foe, many of the occupants of the wardroom professed themselves bored, fed up with cards, word games, and the tunes played on the marine officer's flute. A boxing bout, in the absence of dogs, bears, or spurred cocks to set against each other, was just what the doctor ordered, though the man who held that office aboard this ship was usually too drunk to do anything other than grunt for a refill. Notwithstanding the fact that they were breaking half the rules laid down in the Articles of War, for both fighting and gaming were forbidden, they wanted a chance to engage in a spot of the latter to, as Tabley had explained to his chosen champion, experience a bit of stimulation. Reluctance on behalf of the principals meant little. The Premier ran the ship, for Captain Tucker was an indolent, if compliant, commander who might stir for an enemy warship or an admiral's flag, but not for much less. He kept to his cabin, his books, and his collection of rare butterflies, and appeared on deck for no more than a quarter of an hour twice a day. So when the first lieutenant let it be known that a fight was required, the whole ship was pressed into the goading of the pair, for the crew, landsmen to top rating, were as fond of a bout and a bet as their superiors. So the following Sunday was chosen, and luckily the sea state was, for the waters off Cape Ortegal, at the northern tip of Spain, relatively benign. With the boats over the side and towed astern, and replacement spars shifted, a space in the waist was chalked off for the contest, and it being a make and mend day, when after divine service and dinner the crew had few duties, most of them were free to line the gangways as spectators. It was, in every respect, just like a boxing match ashore, except that no cheering could be permitted lest it bring the captain out of his quarters for a look. Not that he could be in entire ignorance of the event, but it would not do to force from him a decision he would be obliged to make. It was the old blind eye. What he did not see did not happen. The chaplain had a watch to time the contest, and so a very good place from which to observe, while the ship's boys earned themselves a few pennies or favours by relaying the state of matters to those who could not be spared their duties, the officer of the watch and his 2 midshipmen assistants, the quartermaster and his mates conning the ship, the marine sentries on duty at the various fixed posts, and the lookouts aloft who had to remain in place in case a Frenchman coming in or out of the Gironde estuary crested the horizon. "Well now," Tabley concluded, rubbing his prominent chin, "there will be no one aboard Leander willing to stand against you after that display. But I dare say when we join the fleet in a few days there will be others who fancy a bout. They, like the crew here, would not know of your skill, and it will be in our interest not to let on. Hell's teeth, it is only by chance that I myself did. An inter-ship contest could be formal and sanctioned, could even be fought ashore. Who knows, perhaps the admirals may take to such a spectacle, which will mean rich pickings for us if we triumph, for it would not surprise others that we back our own man." "Us," hissed Rufus as Tabley turned and moved away. "What does the sod mean by us?" "Pearce should see this," said Charlie, as the lieutenant appeared to crow as he began to collect his winnings from his wardroom companions, the glum-looking lot who had backed Clype. "If he had got us off, like he said he would." "Enough," snapped Michael, ignoring the pain in his jaw. "You have a way of blaming John Boy for all our ills, Charlie, without ever being sure that he's at fault. Sure he could not have known what was going to happen any more than we did ourselves. We were given 1 hour to shift and no more." Charlie Taverner stood to his full height, the tricorn hat he had hung on to since being pressed set back at a tilt, showing his fair hair. His normal good looks were spoiled by the petulant cast of his features.
"He's deserted us before, and surely he should have got back to save us from this."
"But he did come back the first time," said Rufus Dommett, his face bearing his usual look of innocence.
"If you look across the deck, Charlie," hissed Michael, "I think you will see where the blame lies for this."
Turning, Charlie followed Michael's angry glare. Cornelius Gerson, a man pressed on the same night as them, though not from the Pelican, had been a pest ever since they had first made his acquaintance. He was stood on his own, the crowd having cleared, a hand held out in which he tossed several gleaming coins, evidence that some aboard had not beggared themselves with whores and illicit drink. The look on his absurdly handsome, babyish face was enough to inform the trio from where table he had got his information about Michael's prowess, for Gerson had seen him fight. It would have been he that saw the chance to make money, which seemed to be his abiding concern in life. He, the practised sneak who would have hinted to Tabley that O'Hagan and Clype would be a good match. Only a notion, perhaps, for the sod would never admit to it. But just then the lieutenant moved toward Gerson and patted him on the back with a clear air of gratitude. The look and the sneer aimed at Michael then was like saying that the thought of his culpability was as true as Holy Writ.
"We should have let that bastard drown," growled Charlie.
Michael slowly raised himself off the stool, easing each pain as he did so.
"Jesus, I don't recall having a hand in the saving of him then, but I reckon we all regret the saving of him later. As the Blessed Virgin is my guide, the devil is in him." "Perhaps we should teach him a lesson, Michael. Have him learn that those fists of yours are not there for his profit."
O'Hagan slowly shook his head.
"He's kissed Taberley's arse, Charlie, and lined his purse. If we touch him, we would have to silence the bugger, else we'd be the ones to suffer, for he would not still his tongue."
A sailor approached Gerson as Tabley moved away and asked him for something, which elicited a nod and a hand out, demand for payment. A wad of tobacco was proffered, Gerson's fee for letter-writing, something of which he had let the crew know he was adept. On a make-and-mend day, those with family or a true wife would pass up part of their ration to get a letter penned to go on the next British vessel heading for home. The notion that HMS Leander would join the fleet, as well as Tabley's hopes of a profitable contest, was dashed as soon as they opened up the Lisbon roadstead, for it was bereft of anything other than Portuguese warships, and Captain Tucker was bluntly informed by the naval resident that, having replenished both wood and water, HMS Leander was to proceed with all dispatch to join Lord Hood, who, in company with the Spanish Admiral Lancara and his Cadiz squadron, was taking his fleet into the Mediterranean. Lieutenant Henry Digby, aboard the 12-gun sloop HMS Weasel, could not help but admire what he saw over the stern, even if it had been the same for several days. Under a warm sun and a cloudless sky, the two fleets of Britain and Spain ploughed their way across the deep blue Mediterranean. Leading the main column of 74s was HMS Victory, flagship of the commanding Admiral Lord Hood. Courses, topsails, and jibs stretched taut, with each ship taking station upon her at a strictly defined distance of a cable's length. Over to the south lay the second column, just as rigidly fixed on the flagship of the second-in-command, Admiral Hotham, and God help any vessel which strayed, for its number would be up the masthead of Victory in a flash, the instructions from the captain of the fleet to keep station reinforced with a gun. That the Dons were less rigid in their dispositions, less inclined to properly hold their station on their flagship, was only to be expected. They lacked the sea-going ability and discipline of their British allies. Digby knew if he climbed to the tops with a telescope there to join the lookouts, he would see all around the fleet a screen of frigates and sloops like his own, set at a distance enough to warn should an enemy warship be sighted on the horizon. The other task they performed was just as vital, to bespeak every passing fishing boat or neutral trading vessel to glean information on what was happening to the north, on the great landmass that was France. Thus they had learnt throughout the fleet that Provence and the Rhone Valley were in turmoil from the boats that plied daily between fleet and flagship, that the port city of Marseille had declared against the Jacobins and sent packing, not without bloodshed, those who supported the revolutionary government in Paris. Like many others, Digby had speculated that Lord Hood might make for that place to support the rebels, only to realize when the course remained steady that their C&C had his eye firmly fixed on finding and beating the enemy fleet. That achieved, all things would be possible. Somewhere ahead, off Toulon, would be HMS Brilliant, the vessel on which he had originally set sail from England. The thought of the frigate and her complement brought to him a slew of different emotions. The fact that service under Ralph Berkeley had been less than pleasant, even if at the same time it had been far from dull. Digby had the suspicion that in shifting him to Hotham's flagship in Lisbon, Berkeley had got rid of him at the first opportunity, not because of any inability on his part, but because he felt that all his inferior officers had been foisted on him by the very admiral who was now heading towards a rendezvous off Toulon. It was a double irony that he had been shifted a second time to the sloop HMS Weasel, though recalling the lack of warmth in the wardroom of HMS Britannia towards him as a new officer, the very obvious fact that he had been treated as some kind of interloper, it was hardly surprising. Never having been in a flagship wardroom before, Digby had nothing with which to make a comparison, but it had been made plain to him on his arrival that he had cut across the hawse of the Premier, who had been manoeuvring to have a relative of his own appointed to the first vacant place, that of a lieutenant called Glaister, who had been shifted to Brilliant. The rest of those present, naval and marine officers, the purser and the master, had taken their cue from the man who led their mess, and, while staying within the narrowest band of politeness, had done nothing to make him feel a true part of things. No invitations to play cards or backgammon, little in the way of inquiry about his career to date, or the possibility of mutual acquaintances. It had actually come as a relief when he was told he was being moved to this sloop, presumably because the Premier, a powerful figure aboard any vessel, had preyed upon his captain, who in turn had persuaded Admiral Hotham that Henry Digby, even if he proved disgruntled, was an officer who had little in the way of influence, and one who could safely be ignored. The problem on Weasel was the master and commander who captained her, or rather his addiction to the bottle. A choleric-faced fellow called Benton, he seemed never to be really sober, even when he appeared briefly on deck of a morning to check that his ship was still in sight of the fleet. The man was rude by his very nature, seemingly incapable of saying anything praiseworthy, more inclined to nitpick and complain, his comments just on the very edge of that which could be challenged as outright denigration. Digby's predecessor had used what connections he had to get out from under Benton, something the present incumbent knew he probably lacked. Had he possessed any worthwhile patrons, he would still be aboard Hotham's flagship. On the whole, I think I would prefer to be back in the frigate. "Sir?" asked the young midshipman standing close to him, a freckle-faced youth called Harbin, who made up an application for what he seemed to lack in brains. Digby smiled, wondering if the boy thought him mad talking to himself. "I was just ruminating, young fellow, on the merits of sailing in a frigate as opposed to this vessel." "Weasel is uncomfortably small, sir." "Frigates are certainly not spacious either. But they are rightly called the eyes of the fleet, and often away from the prying interference of very senior admirals. That has to be worth something." The lookout called down, "Victory signalling, Your Honour!" Digby raised his glass to look at the flagship, seeing the various pennants run up, that followed by a puff of white smoke from the signal gun. He needed no book to read them, having seen the flags before. "Agamemnon again," he said. He swung the telescope round to look at the 64, halfway down Hood's main column, and the men running through the rigging, seeking to take in reefs in the sails to slow her down. For the problem for Captain Horatio Nelson was not to keep up with the fleet, but to sail slowly enough to keep proper station, for his ship was a real flyer. A crash of marine boots told Digby his captain was coming on deck, and he and the boy with him turned to raise their hats as Benton, his face dark-skinned over ruby red, took a telescope from the rack and, swaying more than the ship, trained it over the rail.
"I see our friend is entertaining us again," he said.
"Sir."
"One wonders at Captain Nelson sometimes, if his travails are quite as serious as he makes out, given that he's a man fond of attracting attention to himself. It would not surprise me to find he fails to keep station on purpose just to ensure he's not forgotten. Still, Lord Hood seems content to indulge him. Personally, I think it a mistake to do so."
There was a note of pique in that last remark, underlining several things. The first, the rumour that relations between the two admirals were not of the best. The second, that Benton was a partisan of Hotham, who was no doubt the man who had given him this sloop to command. Lastly, that it was known that Lord Hood admired Nelson, a view not universally shared by every captain or admiral, and allowed him a latitude at captains' conferences he rarely extended to others.
"I went aboard Agamemnon with Admiral Hotham once in Lisbon," Benton continued. "I cannot tell you of the state of the deck, nor the familiar way that his men address him. He might as well be a common seaman himself. And the man is a lighthead in the article of drink. 2 or 3 glasses and he's quite intoxicated."
The way Benton said that, Digby suspected that he saw such inability to imbibe as a greater disgrace than an untidy deck or some over-familiarity from the lower deck. More interesting to him was the relationship between the two men who led the fleet, surely something which could affect its effectiveness. On arriving in Lisbon and finding Hotham still there, it soon became common knowledge that Lord Hood had used high words to demand to be told why. To his mind, the fleet he was sent to command should have been on its way to Toulon well before the day it actually sailed, something it did as soon as he could issue his orders. Hotham's protests were not only brushed aside, the man had been dressed down like the newest midshipman, and was boiling with indignation because of it, and it was said he had written home to complain. There was further delay at Cadiz while Hood harried his Spanish allies and got them to sea. So it was that HMS Firefly had found them not much beyond Gibraltar, with Captain Gould going aboard to give Admiral Lord Hood a message that went round every ship under his command in a day, that the enemy fleet had not been ready for sea as of 10 days previously, but that it was working double tides to get yards crossed, sails hoisted, and stores aboard. Firefly was ordered straight back to Toulon, with another sloop in attendance, with orders to ensure that the fleet was kept informed, especially if the French got any capital ships to sea, the whole incident inducing a palpable air of excitement throughout the fleet. In calling aboard all senior officers to disseminate this information, it had been spread by the various barge crews as they returned to their ships. Likewise, it was no secret, happily imparted to those same barge crews by the cabin servants, that Nelson had asked to be sent ahead with as many frigates as could be spared, to join HMS Brilliant and help keep the French fleet locked up, if necessary to fight them as they tried to clear their harbour. Hood had been quite amenable to the idea, but the Dons, lukewarm allies at best, more accustomed to fighting against King George's navy than sailing alongside, had been less enthusiastic, an attitude Hotham had apparently shared. In the face of so many objections, the idea had been dropped.
"Well, Mr. Digby, how are you enjoying service aboard my ship? A different kettle of fish from your previous commission, eh?"
Which one was the man talking about, frigate or flagship? And he had to admit to being surprised by the friendly tone, so very different to that Benton normally employed, which meant that it took Digby a second or two to answer and robbed his reply of any sincerity. "Very much so, sir." The captain picked up the hesitation and reverted to a tone instantly more familiar. His ruby-red cheeks deepened considerably.
"Captain Barclay got rid of you, though, did he not?"
"I'm sure he had his reasons, sir."
"Take care that I don't discern the same ones, Mr. Digby, whatever they are."
With that, Benton left the deck, his gait betraying him just once as the swell showed a slight increase, causing him to stagger. Comparing the two captains, and on the principle of the lesser of two evils, Henry Digby could not but prefer Barclay. A hard, determined man, yes, but a competent sailor, if a touch impetuous and prize-hungry. He, too, was a man with obvious faults, though overindulgence in the bottle was not really one of them. For instance, he found it too easy to be jealous, a fatal flaw in a man who had a young wife with him at sea. There had been that affair with the pressed seaman Pearce, for one, which had caused such disquiet amongst the crew. He could clearly recall himself being unhappy about the punishment, just as he could remember the way that Barclay's wife had made her own displeasure plain. It had proved to be a lesson in the limitations of command, and Digby had taken note of it. Not that Pearce was innocent in the matter of his own misfortune, for the fellow had an arrogance about him which was misplaced given his station. Idly he wondered where he was now. Probably ashore, and damned glad to be so. But that did not last, for his thoughts quickly turned again to his old ship and his old commander, somewhere ahead over the bowsprit, patrolling impatiently while waiting for the fleet to arrive. Chapter 6. John Pearce was sailing the English Channel once more, this time trying to learn as much as he could from the roly-poly owner of the postal brig. The captain of the Lawn was someone to whom he had taken an instant liking. From the moment he had come aboard, he had been in receipt of nothing but kindness and consideration, which extended to the best available accommodation, a fuss about his comfort, plus the provision of food and drink. From the Irish province of Ulster, Captain McGann was easy to like. Everything that happened for good or seeming ill made him laugh, and that was wont to affect his whole being. His shoulders shook and his substantial belly heaved. Things were bound to be amiss with any group of seamen who had spent a last night ashore. There were sore heads aplenty from the young and unattached, allied to regret from those who loved their wives, and impatience from those glad to be free once more from domestic ties. Their captain was the very antithesis of those Pearce had served with, more like a father to the men who crewed his ship than a captain, a feeling that they returned in full measure. A tactile man, dressed in the same manner as his crew, McGann was more inclined to cradle his sailors with a friendly arm than chastise them. It soon transpired, a fact Pearce learned while the Blue Peter was still flying, that every one of them had sailed with him before. They knew his ways and he knew theirs, as well as their families, wives, children, and even the mothers of the younger crew. Lawn was that rare thing, a happy ship, a truth made doubly obvious before they had cleared St. Helens. The men of the brig went about their tasks without so much as a shouted order, for their captains spoke quietly, and followed every request to shift sail or haul on a rope with a sincerely added, "Please." From those same hands, a talkative, friendly lot, Pearce learnt the respect in which he was held, told by each one to whom he spoke that their master was a man who knew the ways of the sea better than anyone afloat, and was, at the self-same time, a complete mandrill ashore, for he drank too much, and had a conviction when inebriated, with no basis whatever in truth, that any woman who came within his line of vision was madly in love with him and determined to drag him to the altar.
"Should you go ashore with him, sir," whispered one older hand, "which is likely at Gibraltar, then be like we is, prepared to either drag him away from some indiscretion, or fight off the bows of whichever woman with whom the silly sod has taken a liberty."
Yet he does not drink at sea. He declined to join me in more than one glass at our first meal.
"Never, sir. He respects the sea too much, and as he says, he's damned if he will surrender any of us up to its tempers for not being as sharp as is needed."
To take such liking to anyone so quickly was a strange sensation for Pearce, hardly surprising given the life he had lived. Too many times growing up he had trusted someone only to be disappointed, which had given him a care in meeting people for the first time. Yet he had felt the need to be completely honest right off, with the captain hinting that having a capital naval fellow on his deck would be good for all sorts of things, not least in a chance to compare the different ways of rigging and sailing. "You will find me a sad example of a naval officer, Mr. McGann," Pearce said, feeling the movement of the ship on his knees as they moved out into the Spithead anchorage. "The uniform is a sham." The response to his candour was that disarming, body-shaking laugh. Encouraged by that to be open, Pearce told his tale, as well as his purpose, told how he had come by his rank, though he played down the action from which it had resulted, praising instead those who had fought with him. "So you see, Mr. McGann, it is not sea service, but a stroke of luck and the aid of others that has got me to where I am." McGann swung the ship's wheel a fraction, reacting to a change in the current as it ran in from deeper water. The wind strengthened too, which called for a slight trimming of the yards. "It is a singular thing, sir, such elevation, though I have heard of it happening afore, and from the same king who showed favour to you. I know, too, that it is not given for light work, but for acts quite exceptional in the fighting line." The man's chest and substantial belly heaved as he laughed once more, his eyes holding a twinkle as he added, "Mr. Pearce, I suspect you are guilty of modesty." "It is some consolation to me to know that I am not too singular. The charge of modesty I deny." "Deny away, sir, for to do so gives you credit." "Needles coming up with the starboard beam, Captain," called a hand who was aloft in the rigging, changing a block, and so could see well ahead over the bowsprit. McGann called back, "Why, thank ye, Harold, much obliged," before speaking softly to Pearce. "A fine lad that, as they all are. His father and I sailed together when I was his age, and we was true mates." "What brought you to this?" "Good fortune, Mr. Pearce, which has stayed true, not least in the willingness of those I know to stick with me, and those who knew me as a lad to teach me the ways of the sea and how to make my way around in it. Sailed to the Carnatic and the Bay of Bengal more'n once, and I was allowed to indulge in a little private trade, buying spices, gold trinkets, and the like, that I could sell on my return. Husbandry gave me enough to put down a sum on a boat, and I engaged myself to the postal service, when it was still a sinecure. By the time Billy Pitt brought it in, I had the Lorne, and was set up to sign for regular service, Gibraltar and back with the government. I was also lucky, as you was not, never to be taken out of a ship or ashore in a time of war, of which we have seen enough these last years, and so never suffered the indignity of being a pressed seaman." "Indignity describes it, Captain McGann, though it gives me no pleasure to say I have known worse." Responding to the inquiring look, Pearce said, "In time, sir, we will be in each other's company long enough to tell you all." "Have it as you will. I will not press you." The pun on the word press brought forth another hearty laugh, one so intense that the captain had to ask Pearce to hold the wheel steady while he recovered. With that in his hand, and feeling that the ship had a life through it, Pearce was once more reminded of the sham of his commission, and the haunting fear that once in the Mediterranean he might be offered a place aboard a ship, which he might have to accept just to stay on the station. "I may press you, sir, for as I have already told you, my ignorance of the sea is great." "A capital play on the word, sir," exclaimed McGann, his being heaving once more, this time accompanied by wheezing as he sought air. "Capital indeed." "But true." "You wish to know more?" "It matters not what I wish. It is more what I need." Short by a head though he was, McGann nevertheless managed to get an arm around Pearce's shoulder. "Then this, sir, shall be your school for the time you are aboard, and I take leave to say you could find none finer, for there is not a hand serving on this vessel that would not be pleased to instruct, as am I. But recall this, if you want to stay off the deck and out of wind, water and cold, that is your privilege." Pearce hardly hesitated a second. "I would be happy to be your pupil, sir." "Then I, too, am happy. I ain't never taught a man aught, but I have learned something in return, sir. I look forward to having you on my deck, but just as much, I anticipate with pleasure the conversation we will have when we are below." Lawn was constructed for speed through the water, of narrow build, carrying as few stores as possible, no cargo and dam stability, for the contract McGann had was not one to allow him much in the way of double ventures. His task was to get the mails to Gibraltar and back as speedily as possible, avoiding any attempt to intercept them now the nation was again at war with France.
12 days is around the norm for the passage, though I have had it take twice that time in the winter months. Made it in under 5 days one trip. Never known such a wind oblige for the whole journey. Blew hard and consistent from the northeast to push us down the channel, then swung round to a fine strong northwesterly off the Lizard, so that the lee rail was never clear of the sea all the way south, with every man jack up from below to take pleasure in flying. 14 knots was our best cast of the log. 14 knots, Mr. Pearce! Have you ever heard the like?
According to McGann, they were doing very well at the moment, under a bright blue sky, a warm late July sun, and a gentle easterly breeze right astern. The log had run off 6 knots on the last cast. Pearce sure of this, for it had been himself in the chains doing the casting, with the man accustomed to the task there to make sure he learned to do it right, and didn't risk drowning by too much enthusiasm. Prior to that, he had been aloft, helping to run out the booms for the skysails, then going out onto those booms to haul the sails aloft, lashing them on and then loosing the ties and letting them fall, bare soles bouncing in the foot-ropes, his shirt billowing out on the breeze, constantly admonished by the man next to him to "Clap on, sir, clap on. Let us keep one hand for the boat." And it had been a pleasure, so different from when he'd been aloft on either Griffin or Brilliant, different because it was voluntary, the pleasure doubled by making a real effort to do the tasks well, even more pleased by the way he was cheerfully egged on by the men with whom he was working. Those same fellows could not tie a knot or look to splice a rope without calling out to show how it was done. They couldn't haul a fall through a block without explaining why one line was on a single block, when another, for its weight, needed the gearing of a double. And he hauled with them when hauling was required, the tar on his palms like a badge rather than the disgrace it had previously been. John Pearce was enjoying himself. Soon they were past the Lizard, and in darkness they had made their southing to run well clear of Ushant. The weather was good, the sea steady, a long, comfortable swell that hardly disturbed the plates on McGann's dinner table. Their course was set, and a trusty pair were on the wheel, with half the crew standing by as a watch, for like the Navy, a postal packet didn't shorten sail at night. Earlier that same day he had been instructing Pearce in the use of a sextant, expressing no surprise that he had no prior knowledge of an instrument he owned, albeit one that had suffered from use in hands that had clearly, more than once, dropped it.
"Now, once you've got the sun reflected all right, bring it down to the horizon, waving a fraction left and right, which tells you when it touches and stops it dipping below the horizon."
Doing that twice a day was something Pearce mastered. What he found impossible were the calculations necessary to make sure the time was correct. This before Captain McGann could adjust one of his chronometers, the difference between the one set to Greenwich time and the result giving the ship's position. Nighttime sightings were a mystery and likely to remain so. Shooting stars, as his mentor called it, with 7 different celestial objects to aim at, and the obscurity of something called a nominal point to commence matters. McGann, who would not suffer another soul to touch them, took a cloth and gently rubbed one of his beautiful clocks.
"It be hard to think of a life without them now, yet it is not more than 30 years since Harrison proved their worth. Many's a sailor was lost and went to Davy Jones without them. And here we are, running past the Sillies. Did you ever hear of an admiral called Sir Cloudsley Shovel?"
Pearce smiled and shook his head at the outlandish name. He had learned very early on that McGann loved to tell a tale, what sailor did not, just as he had learned that, unlike a lot of folk, he knew how to do it without boring the breeches off the listener.
"This be in the year 1707, and it goes to show the worth of Harrison's invention, which came about as a result, though it took time, if you'll forgive the pun. Old Shovel was bringing a squadron of ships back home, his course set for the Channel and Portsmouth, when one of his men told him he was sailing a risky course, that he would run foul of the Scilly Isles if he kept on. Being a choleric bugger and sure of himself, Shovel pulled a strop and had flogged the man that dared to question his orders. He then held to the course he had set and ran half his fleet onto the lee shore and drowned them. Thousands of sailors lost on a man's temper. They say he survived and was murdered for his ring, which serves him right.
There was a moment when both men contemplated that, Pearce having an uncomfortable memory of struggling in a raging sea that was hammering a rock-strewn shore. It was not a pleasant image. "I feel safe in the notion that I can master the instrument, Mr. McGann, and the clocks present no problem at all, for a careful child could adjust those. But I fear the mathematics will stump me." That was no lie. His father had sought to teach him mathematics, but was only competent in the basics of adding, subtraction, and multiplication. His Parisian tutor, the Abbé Morland, with whom he had studied for 2 years, was steeped in the classics, and knew nothing about such matters as geometry and spherical trigonometry, probably seeing them, though he was no zealot, as the work of the devil. Pearce continued to assert that, however interesting it was to be shown something new and instructed in matters outside his experience, it was only curiosity that made him attend to it. He had no notion ever to use it, a declaration at which McGann was quick to scoff.
"But you ain't got my drift, Mr. Pearce. I am saying such things as best left to those that are brought up to it."
Responding to Pearce's inquiring look, he shook with humour once again.
"Do you think all your braided officers know about navigation? Do you think they are all sure which sails to set aloft to get the best out of a ship, or where the rocks lie on a lee shore? Who is it that stows the hold and trims the barkie so she sails smooth? It ain't the captain, that's for certain."
"I suspect they must know about navigation, even if your late and unlamented Sir Cloudsley Shovel didn't."
"There are those that do, and capital seamen they are, Cook and that fellow Bligh, to name but 2. And I know it has become common these days to expect a commissioned officer to find his way about in all manner of things. But to my mind, a wise man leaves such matters to the vessel's master. When I first went to sea as a lad near 40 year past, I admit in merchant service, a ship's captain was just that, the fellow who sorted the running of the barkie, and made certain that each man was in the right place to carry out his given task, as well as to do it proper, and it wasn't too difficult from what I've heard in the Navy."
"Is that not dangerous?"
"Not if you has the right people, good people, and unlike that daft shovel bugger, you listen to him. A wise captain has a good master. A wise master has good mates. That Bligh I mentioned started life as a master's mate, and that was his rating on Cook's first South Sea adventure, which not many seem to recall. That's where he learned his skills, not in a wardroom or standing watch on the deck of a king's ship."
"No doubt it was in those he learned to ferment mutiny."
"Happen, for there are those who claim he brought it on himself. Be that as it may, there is no doubt he's a capital seaman, has to be, to sail 4,000 miles in an open boat. I would trust him to keep me safe if he was setting my course. That is not somewhat I would say to every naval captain I have come across."
"I'm not sure what you're trying to say."
"What is a king's ship for, sir?"
A cautiously raised eyebrow forced McGann to continue.
"Why, it's for fighting, is it not?"
"Yes."
"Then the job of a captain on a king's ship is to make sure that when it comes to the moment of truth, when the enemy is beam on and firing broadsides, that his ship is set for the response. That does not require him to get it in the right place, or set the right suit of sails to do so, for he will have folk on board who know a damn sight more than he does about such things. But he must have men on his cannon who can fire and reload, even if the air be full of metal and wood splinters. He must be the kind that can lead when boarding, and fight with a cutlass, pistol, and pike. Now you have been modest on the question of the Valmy, but you have yet to smoke that Portsmouth is my home. Ashore I am a man who likes to take a drink, and that I has a fair pair of lugs with which to hear what you might term chatter."
Seeing McGann tug at a fleshy lobe, emphasizing that he did indeed have large and good ears, or lugs as he termed them, Pearce adopted a tone of voice larded with sarcasm. "No doubt there has been a certain amount of talk in the taverns. If my experience is anything to go by, most of it will be nonsense." McGann's face filled with blood and his body began to heave, which increased as he confirmed what Pearce had said, so that his words were delivered with a degree of spluttering. "I won't deny that a rate of it is. For one, that there was a midshipman in the Valmy capture who did prodigious deeds, and lost half his limbs in the doing of it, according to some. Depending on which tale you listened to, and how gone in drink was the tale-teller, he lost an eye, his right or left arm, and for certain at least one of his legs, and had musket balls and sword thrusts enough through his frame to make a fair imitation of a sieve for fine flour." Pearce smiled and shrugged. "Few tales do not grow in the telling, Mr. McGann, perhaps even that of your Cloudsley shuffle." As an attempt to change the subject, it failed abysmally. As soon as McGann could control his hilarity, he spoke again. "Yet what do I have sitting at my table drinking cider but that very same fellow, whole and hearty and scarce a scratch, which I do hope you ain't going to deny. Nay, fill it in the tale, and certain truth from gossip. It seems what you did was singular." "That word again. I'm beginning not to like it." "If it be the one that fits." McGann stopped smiling, and for once his face was serious. "I am happy to teach what I can, as is every man of my crew, as I know you have found. But there is scarce time enough to turn you into a cook or a bligh. So I have this advice for you. Learn what you can, but never forget that the prime job of a navy officer is fighting, and in that region you has better credentials than most." "Except I have no desire to be a navy officer." "You will forgive me for going beyond the bounds of being polite, but what in hell's name do you have a desire to do? And don't go telling me again about rescuing your old shipmates. Now, I am going to say that I took to you the minute I clapped eyes on you, 'cause there was no showing away about what you had done, and that is a feeling that has only grown on acquaintance." "It is," Captain McGann returned in full measure. "For which I thank you. I am going to tread the path of discourtesy by alluding to the fact that you are without a father, God rest his soul." That was not a sentiment Adam Pearce would have appreciated, but this was not the moment to say so. "And being without that, you lack anyone to advise you." "Which you presumably intend to do," said Pearce, his smile now absent. "I see I have angered you, young sir, but if I have, my intentions are good ones. What I am saying is this: if you doubt where your future lies, you could do worse than the King's service. You're a fighter, lad, and a proven one, and I will hazard that, with what is going on in the new war with the French, that Farmer George and Billy Pitt need fighting men more than they need men that can get themselves to the South Seas and back again." Tabley got his fight, but in Gibraltar, HMS Leander calling at the Rock to deliver duplicate dispatches, and only because his captain refused to sail on into the Mediterranean without a full supply of wood and water, notwithstanding a dispute with the commanding admiral at Gibraltar, who wanted him back at sea forthwith. The excuse for delay was simple. With no British base in the inland sea, and no knowledge of whether purchase would be possible in places like Genoa and Leghorn, nor any faith in the Spanish alliance, a hold full of stores, 4 months' supply, was not only wise but essential. That Captain Tucker, taking advantage of the current state of relations with Spain, could take his net for a day to a hot and arid country he had never visited, and possibly add to his butterfly collection species he had never before seen, was just an accidental dividend. With only a patrolling naval presence at the port, it was the army who provided a contestant. Easy to arrange, because soldiers, bored stiff on garrison duty, were so easy to bait, as well as being boastful coves who had never allowed that the navy might have a champion to outshine their own. And as men who had their commissions through purchase, they generally had the means as well as the inclination to wager high, which suited a confident Leander wardroom. Michael O'Hagan had been excused duty in anticipation of Lisbon. On the journey to Gibraltar that had continued, his sole task to train with Clype, and to hone what were rough skills into those that would tell. They were at it again now, in the waist, again clear of boats, in the space where the first bout had taken place.
"The pity is, O'Hagan," Tabley said, "is that it will have to take place on our quarterdeck, for we dare not let the crew ashore for fear they will try to run, and there'll be a damn near mutiny if we denied them a sight of your victory."
Michael was looking at the rock, wondering where on such a small outcrop they could desert to. "I might lose." Tabley's face was bland, the voice emotionless, but it was just as threatening, perhaps more so than if he had barked his response.
"You would be best not even thinking in those terms. There will be a great deal of money riding on you, and I doubt that those set above you would take kindly to losing it. You might find that punishment in that quarter would be greater than any you could receive from a fellow boxer."
"So," Michael said once Tabley walked away, "it is a win or the grating every time I so much as fart." Clype, his previous opponent, patted him with a heavily bandaged and padded hand.
"The army man will be big, Michael. They tend that way, do bullocks. But that doesn't mean he will have skill."
"Do you know, Clype, I am as gentle as a lamb sober." "But I," added Charlie, taking a wardroom-donated towel to wipe him down, "have seen you in drink, Michael."
"Sure, I did my ditch-digging by day, Charlie, and took my pleasure when the sun went down."
There was a slightly sour note in Charlie Taverner's response. They might have both been pressed from the same tavern, but they had not been friends in the Pelican, Charlie being a fly sort, a man who had once made his way in the world by fleecing the unwary, had more than once tried to do the same to Michael O'Hagan. Then there had been a small matter of rivalry over the affections of one of the serving girls.
"I recall where your pleasure was directed," said Charlie.
Michael brightened then, lifting the gloom that filled him at the prospect of the coming fight.
"Ah, the sweet Rosie, as plump as a Wicklow cow, and twice as willing."
"For those that could pay," moaned Rufus, which brought a bitter nod of approval from his friend Charlie. Michael hit the boy gently with one of his own padded hands.
"You could have had all the coin in the land, Rufus, but I doubt you would have satisfied Rosie. There's not enough of you."
"I got what it takes," Rufus protested, his face reddening in a deep blush. "You mark my words."
"What's important," interrupted Clype, "is whether Michael here has what it takes to beat the army. For if he ain't, them bastards in the wardroom won't confine their fury to him."
"Boats coming off!" shouted a voice from the gangway. "Dozens of the buggers, full of redcoats and blue." Tabley appeared again, this time with Gerson in tow, though he hung back.
"There's not a man aboard who has not been to the Pearce for a loan, O'Hagan. The whole ship is riding on you."
He passed some of those men on his way up to the deck, Leander's as well as the Griffins, who, like the Pelicans, had been shifted aboard without so much as a by your leave. First to encourage was Latimer, an elderly sailor with a wrinkled walnut complexion, who had proved aboard HMS Griffin to be a wise old cove.
"We beat the French, Michael. Be a pity to lose to the bullocks."
"Well said, lads," called Blubber, another Griffin, fat and sweating in the heat. "We've got money coming from the Valmy, Michael, and it's all on you."
"You've got money coming should you ever set foot ashore and free, Blubber,"
added Latimer, before patting his champion and pushing him on.
"Do your best, and I for one will rest content."
The decks were for visiting dignitaries, and there was no shortage of those. Army officers came aboard in their regimentals, Navy in their best blue coats and snowy breeches. The word had gone out amongst the traders and officials on the rock, and they were there in numbers too, happy to chuck coins into a half-barrel carried round by a midshipman, this to cover the cost of entertaining them with food and wine. The crew were given the shrouds and yards from which to observe the contest, and they were now as crowded as the deck, and since the approval of the Admiral had been sought and given, as being a welcome diversion on a tedious posting, there would be cheering as well. The most senior officers of both services, along with the Leander's wardroom, sat on the poop. The army man, Rafe Braddock, was huge, giving a good 3 inches on Michael, with plenty of muscle as well as a face that looked as though it had taken enough punishment to last a lifetime. A flat nose where the bone had been too crushed to repair, heavy eyebrows that did nothing to disguise the thick scar tissue underneath, wooden teeth which were removed to show pink gums framed by lips that had evidence of 6 poorly healed splits. Taberley had done his homework, for he was no fool, and Michael knew that his opponent was a soldier always in trouble with his superiors, a drinker and brawler who was regularly given several dozen lashes at the wagon wheel. This proved when he removed the cloak he was wearing to reveal a back so crisscrossed with scars even the hardest of the sailors gasped. The fellow was used to pain, and he and Clype had opined that the wiles that had failed in the previous fight might be the best avenue in this one, for given this fellow's reputation, he lacked in brains what he had in sheer bulk. Just hitting him around the body and head might not suffice. Michael had to draw him out so that he could strike in places where a well-delivered blow would down him. It was odd to O'Hagan how sensitive to the mood of the crowd he had become. The air of confidence that their champion would triumph took a dent as soon as the soldier appeared, and fell further when he revealed his muscled torso and his lacerated back, so there was a flurry of late betting as some tried to cover themselves both ways. Behind him stood Clype, Charlie, and Rufus, the first to advise, the other 2 to wipe away blood and sweat. An army major checked his hands to ensure that nothing was contained in them, like a piece of lead, while Taberley did the same to Braddock. Then both men were brought forward to their marks, just far enough apart for them to beat each other. Then the rules were read out. Toe to the line, pull back for more than a count of 3, and the bout was forfeit. Close to Braddock, and looking into eyes hooded by scarred brows, Michael reckoned that Clype had the right of it. He didn't reckon he was facing a fellow who would back off from the line. The man would stand his ground and take whatever he was given, his aim to wear down his opponent to the point where he could deliver a killer blow. And looking at the hands, which were huge even to a man who had big mitts of his own, and the thick arms to back them up, he reckoned that blow could be fatal.
"Ride his punches at first, Michael,"
Clype whispered, as if he hadn't said it 12 times already.
"Sway back and see what he's about before you weigh in total."
"Gentlemen," said Taberley, holding up a handkerchief, "are you ready?" Both fighters nodded and the handkerchief dropped, an act which killed off the murmuring that had been rippling through the crowd as the spectators waited for the first blows to be struck. It was Braddock who obliged, catching Michael in the upper rib cage with a telling right-handed blow that hurt even as he rode it, which brought forth an encouraging yell from his support. The soldier tried to follow that up with a left, only to find it parried, with Michael feinting to hit him and force him to back off. Braddock did no such thing. He stood rock-like, so Michael hit him hard just to let him know he had a fight on his hands. That produced a gummy grin. Those blows had set the crowd off, with both sets of partisans yelling encouragement as the fighters began to exchange. Braddock seemed content to keep hitting the same spots over and over again. There was no science in his assault, unlike Michael, who tried to vary what he did, striking different parts of the body. All the while Clype was shouting in his ear, "Ride it out! Ride it out!" That followed by, "Find the spot, Michael, find the spot!" The man he was coaching thought that easier said than done. He hit Braddock's nose hard, and it didn't bleed. It was too smashed already for anything to break. Strike his head, and all he did was shake it and swing back a killer blow. Punches to the body seemed useless. The man did not even move at the heaviest delivery. So Michael decided to use time. No man could fight without using up his puff. He must conserve his and let Braddock squander his own. Then he would get a chance to aim at the target that might bring a result, the point of Braddock's jaw. Michael had experienced before that strange clarity which comes when fighting, the heightened awareness of everything around you as well as that immediately in front. He never took his own gaze off Braddock's eyes, for in shifting they began to tell him with increasing accuracy where the next blow would fall. He was aware, too, of his own balance, and how by adjusting it he could weather the storm of the man's aggression. More tellingly, he could almost feel the mood of the watching crowd, tell that the soldiers were exulting while his own supporters and backers were more muted. There was also the contemplation of losing deliberately just to infuriate Taberley and his ilk, not to mention that gobshite Gerson. But that had to be put aside. Too many of his shipmates had borrowed money riding on his success. So he took more punches than he gave, which were painful, though never hitting anything vital, dropping his head to blunt blows to that part of his body so that it now ached, as did his upper arms and shoulders, where by swaying aside he could deflect Braddock's intent. And he did strike back, mostly to parry what might be coming, but giving his opponent cause often enough to blink in surprise when he landed a real power punch. Time lost any meaning as thud followed thud, and sometimes the crowd were near silent long enough to allow the sound of bone on flesh to be paramount. For the longer it went on, the less sure both sets of supporters were about the outcome. O'Hagan was not, for in his fierce concentration he knew that Braddock was not only tiring physically, but he was also running out of ideas, and that was sapping his will to continue. On more than one occasion Michael could have stepped forward and hit him hard enough to knock him back from his tow line. Yet he did not do so, and Braddock, who might be as thick as a first-rate scantling's, was enough of a bruiser to sense that he was being played with, and that added anger to the other dearth he had of ideas. If the spectators were confused, Clype was not. He knew enough, and had seen enough in his own fighting, to read the way matters were going.
"You'll have him soon, Michael. Hold your method."
With both bruisers wheezing like prize bulls, such whispered encouragement was hard to hear, but Michael was encouraged by the sentiment, even if he ignored it. He did not hold fast. He upped his pace and the power of his response, hitting harder and more often, making the man think, for he reckoned he knew better than Clype how to play Braddock. If the man lacked brains, then the notion was to confuse what few he possessed, to do what was not expected. His temper was reflected in the power of his support, who were now screaming with bloodlust, not sated by the amount already spilt, for around both men's feet what had been spots had merged by increase, foot movement and sweat, into a mess that seeped into the deck. The blow that finished matters came suddenly, but it was planned. Michael had lined up Braddock to protect one side of his body with a series of hard left-handed blows, for several minutes following that with mere feints to the right. That quickly followed by a renewed assault on a spot between ribcage and breeches that was now black with bruising, and which with each assault became increasingly painful. 3 blows there, one parried, one successful, were followed by what Braddock again surmised was a feint. It was not. It was that all-out blow to the point of the jaw that O'Hagan had had in his mind from the very outset of the contest, that punch which sent a message to the top of the man's head that was lethal in its effect. And Michael got right that most necessary thing to deliver, his balance. Tough Braddock might be, big and larded with muscle, but on the receipt of that punch, he dropped like a stone. Chapter 7. With the shoreline in view, no great feat of navigation was required to bring HMS Brilliant to a rendezvous with Gleister and Fairmelow and the fishing boat they had taken in to look over the enemy, the sight of which brought everyone on deck. However, the news he brought, that a large element of the Toulon fleet was ready to weigh, did nothing for the comfort of the captain. Ralph Barclay, as he paced up and down the windward side of the quarterdeck, was torn between 2 alternatives. He could up his helm and head east, hoping to intercept and alert his admiral. He had to assume Hotham was now on his way. Or he could stay on station and keep the French in view, for the very obvious reason that if they were to put to sea there was no telling in which direction they would sail, and that was something his commanding officer would want to know. The latter required him to make immediate, if long-range, contact, and to maintain it in the face of any escorting frigates, and no doubt sloops and corvettes, which would definitely try to head him off. He would have to close at night to have any chance of maintaining his vigil, with the concomitant risk that at first light he might find that he had either lost them or that they were close enough, both frigates and ships of the line, to overwhelm him. Duty was one thing, risk to reputation another, and it was that which decided him on the latter course, despite its attendant dangers. No one would condemn him for shadowing the enemy, or, should the worst happen, being taken by a superior force in an attempt to do so, and he would fight them before he would strike his colours. But if he ran east and missed Hotham, leaving him blind with an enemy fleet at sea, he would very likely face censure, for it was only a meeting of capital ships that could resolve the issue of who controlled the Mediterranean. Challenged, he would have vehemently denied that his own personal standing in the navy had anything to do with his choice, that he craved to be known as a bold and aggressive commander, yearned to be lauded for carrying off some stroke that would make him famous, like victory in a single-ship action, the acme of achievement in his chosen profession, nor that the previous act of running from his enemies still rankled, and was still, he was sure, to be seen in the attitude of his inferior officers. It was one of the benefits of captaincy. The decision was his, and no one on his deck had the right to question it. He turned to face a quarterdeck full of people pretending not to keep him in the corner of their vision. The only man actually looking at him directly was the surgeon, Lutyens, but he had become so accustomed to scrutiny from that quarter that he hardly noticed. As he began to issue his instructions, it was to others that Lutyens turned, whipping out one of his little notebooks, eager to record their reactions to the news that they were to sail into an area which, even to a lubber like him, was clearly one of danger.
"Mr. Collins, set me a course to close Toulon once more, though as far south as is consistent with the need to spot their topsails once they've cleared inshore waters. Mr. Glaister, I want as many bulkheads as we do not absolutely require out of the way, as well as all unnecessary furniture struck below. Make sure the gunner has enough cartridges filled for a running fight, and that the small arms are ready for use, with everything sharpened. I want every moment used to practice clearing for action and getting the guns run out. The time that takes has to be shaved if we are to have any chance should it come to a contest."
The dirt on the man's face, streaked as it was, heightened the look in his pale blue eyes, one of eager anticipation at the prospect of action. Looking around, Lutyens could see that expression was present in nearly every countenance, from common seaman to officer. He had seen it before, that keen anticipation of a contest, which seemed quite capable of ignoring the fact that it was of necessity bloody, and that in such an encounter men could die. "The manger, sir." That, after weeks at sea and a number of Emily's dinners, was not as full as it had been.
"It will have to stay where it is for now, but if we face action, what we have left must go overboard. We cannot risk the ship for a pig and a couple of goats."
Berkeley paused for a moment to consider the next step.
"Mr. Fairmeadow, prepare the pinnace, step a mast, and take aboard men to sail her, as well as stores and a water barrel, which will hold enough for a week. That you will have to take ashore and fill as soon as the light begins to go. I leave it to you how you accomplish that. Once you have water aboard, you are to hold to this station and keep a lookout for either the fleet or any ship sent ahead with dispatches and orders."
There was gloom in the boy's positive reply, for if there was a successful action he would miss out, and perhaps on the rewards or any glory that would accrue.
"If your water runs low, you will have to replenish that again from the shore. And for food, you can live off the fishermen, who I'm sure will be happy to sell you the contents of their cooking tubs. Take a copy of the signals for compass headings as well, and keep a sharp lookout, for once we have discerned the course of the enemy, I will try to close with you and give you what I know of their intentions."
He did not add that he would be back on this same station and facing censure if he lost them. Below he was brusque, quite sharp in the way he told his wife that there would be no more formal dinners for a day or two, and that they would be obliged to live on the same food as the rest of the crew.
"Likewise, I intend that the main cabin bulkhead is to be hinged up, and the pantry done away with, though our sleeping quarters will remain. You may wish to sort out some clothing for a few days, which should be practical. Everything that can be done without will go into the hold."
Emily just nodded and went into their sleeping cabin to comply.
"Shanton!"
Berkeley shouted,
I want a couple of fresh shirts and a pair of clean breeches, then strike my chest below. Once that is done, prepare the lady hole. Give it a good clean with fresh vinegar, and make it comfortable for my wife."
HMS Brilliant was round and on her new course, and above his head Barclay could hear the running feet of the men manning the falls as Collins sent aloft sail after sail, just as he could feel the increase in the heel of the ship as that extra canvas worked on her trim. The pinnace, towed astern to keep her seams tight, for the weather was hot and dry, was being hauled in, this while Fairmelow picked his men, 4 at most in case they needed to row, and took aboard biscuit and some grog, for men deprived of their daily beer would be crabbed without it, as well as some funds borrowed from the purser to purchase fish. He was back on deck again as the midshipman prepared to go over the side into a boat that now had a mast and a furled gaff sail, with a block at the masthead to run it up and down as required.
"You have a timepiece, Mr. Fairmelow."
"I do, sir," the boy replied, tapping his waistcoat pocket.
"Then use it, as well as the sun, to aid you in fixing your position and nurturing your stores. Always make sure you have the shore in sight at first light, but if you have not, at that time of day any drifting that has taken you off is easily corrected. Put one man to look out to the east, for sight of the fleet, and another looking west for me. And, Mr. Fairmelow, keep moving. Do not be tempted to just drift, for that will do nothing to keep either you or your men sharp."
Fairmelow wanted to ask what to do if no one came, fleet or messenger, but he reckoned that would not elicit an answer that included any instructions. Subject to the vivid imagination that went with his age, he had a vision of drifting around in these waters forever, broiled by the sun if he was not capsized by a sudden squall or taken by an enemy cruiser. Instead, he lifted his hat, tried to pretend that he was pleased by the responsibility being entrusted in him, and prepared to go over the side. The voice that came then did something to lift his mood. "Mr. Fairmelow," called Emily Barclay, who had followed her husband on deck, "may I wish you safety, and say that we all hope to see you aboard again soon. Until then, if you have no objections, I will include you in my prayers." That made Fairmelow smile, puff up slightly, and produce a brave statement. "Then I feel sure that no danger will threaten me, Mrs. Barclay."
"On your way, boy," growled Ralph Barclay, "and pay attention to your orders."
"Aye, aye, sir." The boat on the lee side of the frigate was bucking along, lashed to the ship, so that he had to jump aboard, only saved from the indignity of ending up in the thwarts by the strong arms of Dysart, who did not wait for the nominal officer to issue orders to cast off. By the time Fairmelow had taken station on the tiller, turning it sharply to starboard, the sail was run up and the cutter was sailing away.
"Mr. Glaister, when all else is completed, fetch out the boarding nets and lay them along the bulwarks. I want them shipped as night falls, and lookouts with muskets set at 10-foot intervals on both sides of the ship. I have no notion to be taken by an enemy boarding party during the hours of darkness."
Ralph Barclay went back to his captain's walk, feeling the warm southerly wind on his face, bracing himself against the heel of the now racing frigate, going over in his mind every scenario he could think of that might bring danger to his command, trying to foresee ways of countering them. That was when the thought came to him that the French would not have seen the fishing boat, and might not know that their state of readiness had been compromised. In his mind he formulated a plan to discomfit them, to either keep them in place or hurry them to sea before they were fully ready.
"Mr. Collins, a change of course. Take us in closer to Toulon. Mr. Glaister, prepare the signal flags for the message, 'Enemy in sight,' that followed by a blue Peter to denote they are preparing to weigh, then repeated, and get some powder charges up to the signal gun, which we will be firing at regular intervals."
The desire to seek an explanation was plain on the Premier's face, but he had the good sense not to ask for one, or to question whether the proposed signal would be understood. The order went out to trim the yards as the rudder brought Brilliant round on a more northerly course, which took her off her very best point of sailing and cut her speed.
"We just raised the tip of Mount Faron, your honour."
The lookouts up there would have him soon, and there was no way to bluff, given that every feature of the frigate would be known to them. He anticipated that those enemy frigates would intercept again, seeking to drive him off. Indeed, he was somewhat surprised that they had not been set further out to sea for the purpose. Speculation about that produced several possibilities. Overconfidence that they had driven him off station, or what he hoped was the cause, that they were too fearful of being caught in a single-ship action by a well-worked-up British opponent to close with him unless they could guarantee each other support.
"Dinner for the men as normal, Mr. Glaister. The officers to take theirs at the same time. Once that is over, we may fully clear for action."
Below, Shenton was standing beside the cook, much to the man's annoyance, as he tagged the pieces of salted pork he was taking from a barrel, each required to have the mess-numbered metal tag attached. None could be given out until the captain's steward had examined it, his aim to find the leanest piece for the main cabin. If he was going to be forced to eat seaman's food, then he wanted the cut with the least gristle.
"That one!"
he cried as a slightly oversized portion of leg came out, adding with a leer,
"And we'll want some scouse cookie. Can't wait to see Mrs. Barclay's face when she has to pop that and a biscuit full of weevils into her ever-so delicate mouth."
His last task was to pass over a bag filled with a mixture of suet and raisins, which would be boiled to provide a pudding.
"Don't go putting it too close to the burning wood, Cookie. It has a fair bit of brandy mixed in." "And no doubt you'll be having more than your share of that, Shenton," moaned Devereux, a burly brute of a fellow, waiter for the day to his mess, one of the sailors forced to linger for his portion. Shenton blew a soft raspberry. He was not cautious with Devereux, unlike most of the crew, his station as the captain's steward protection enough. The man was a bully who used his size and, if necessary, his fists to get what he wanted, usually a share of someone's grog ration, husbanding that to be consumed in a binge. This had seen him at the grating 3 times already this commission, for he was not a quiet drunk. Not that Devereux complained. He took his dozen without a murmur, and was never absent from duty for more than a couple of hours after that. He was in many ways one of the banes of Ralph Barclay's life, for he deeply admired his captain. In fact, he had come aboard as a volunteer as soon as he heard of the commission, a feeling not reciprocated in the slightest measure. "Goes with his station," Shenton added. "There's to be some perks to make up for being on the rough end of Barclay's tongue day in, day out."
"Like we ain't, brother," growled Martin Dent, a spotty youth with a badly set broken nose, not long moved from being a marine drummer, really a ship's boy, to being a topman, one of the ship's elite. He could speak up because at his age all he would ever get from Devereux was a slap, and being a cheeky bugger, he had had a rate of those in his few years, none of which had stilled his tongue. The sentiment was taken up by the rest of the people waiting with their mess kits, which manifested itself as an angry ripple of discontent.
"Belay that!"
Devereux shouted, before glaring at Martin, who dared to glare back.
"I won't hear a word again the captain. The man might be hard, but he be fair."
That brought immediate quiet, with no one prepared to challenge a statement they believed to be untrue, for Devereux would mark the speaker, and there would be a price to pay.
"What's barking about then, Shenton?"
demanded one of them, to lighten an atmosphere that had suddenly become tense.
"Why, ain't you smoked it, matey?" hooted the steward. "We's going to sail right into the port and take on the whole French fleet. Death for you, but glory and a gazette for our beloved captain. Must be off. Got to get his pistol primed and ready."
"You reckon he licks Barclay's boots?" asked Martin.
"Kisses his arse, more like, mate," said the cook,
before raising his heavy meat cleaver and waving it under the bully's nose, daring Devereux to gainsay him.
"And he's too spavin a creature to even consider the arse we all anchor after."
Ralph Barclay did not enjoy his dinner. He found seaman's fare brought back unpleasant memories of a life spent in a midshipman's berth, that and wardrooms where he and his fellows had lacked the funds necessary for the luxury of private stores. But it had the effect of pleasing him none the less, making him feel that he was at one with the men he commanded, which in turn decided him to do a touch of Harry in the Night, to tour the ship like Shakespeare's King Henry and impart encouraging words to his crew. He was unaware that the smiles he bestowed on most of those he encountered induced feelings of deep distrust. That was until he came to Devereux.
"Is we going to have a fight, your honour?"
It seemed a strange question from a man who had more fights than most, usually with people he beat, though there had been one, which Berkeley was not supposed to know about, who had bested him.
"Only one we can win, Devereux. I have a fancy to board an enemy, Captain. Then I hope you get your wish. If we do, your honour, rest easy that I will be at your right arm, and God help the sod who tries to harm you."
Even in the gloom of the 'tween decks, the lanterns picked up the sincere look in the man's eyes. Common seaman's fare did not extend to doing without wine, and Ralph Berkeley had allowed himself several glasses more than normal to cover the taste, so that his temper was doubly mellow. Devereux's words touched him in a way they would not have done had he been strictly sober. Indeed, he might have told him brusquely to keep to his station, for outside young midshipmen and junior officers he had brought on in the service, he had never had what could be called a personal following, certainly not amongst the lower deck.
"Why, I thank you for that, Devereux, and may I say, if you were to moderate your drinking, I dare say you might find that your station aboard ship would improve."
"God help us," said Coyle, the master-at-arms, still on crutches, but overseeing the sharpening of the cutlasses and tomahawks, and close enough to hear the exchange. Kemp, the rat-faced individual who had got himself moved to ship's corporal, and so was doing the actual grinding, replied, "Amen to that."
"Mr. Glaister's compliments, your honour," came a voice from the gangway. "There's a sail been spotted due east, and the lookout thinks it's one of them French frigates." "If it is only one, Devereux, you will get your wish."
Back on deck, Ralph Berkeley nodded to his wife, who was taking the sun with Surgeon Lutchins on the poop. He then took up a telescope and trained it in the direction indicated. In the heat of the early afternoon there was a haze in the air that made a clear sight of anything from the deck hard, but he held his station for an age until the first faint outline of the enemy vessel, a wisp of topsails and a wind-blown tricolor pennant, came into view.
"Lutine,"
he said finally, the bigger of the two he had faced before, which would mean quite a contest.
"Look out! Any other ships in the offing?" "None, sir."
"Do you think he means to take us on, sir?" asked Glaister.
"Possibly."
For once Ralph Berkeley wanted to think aloud, to share his thoughts rather than husband them. He answered his first lieutenant, but in a voice loud enough to be heard over a decent stretch of the ship.
"His task has changed, Mr. Glaister. He cannot afford the luxury of us getting sight of what is at anchor in the Grand Rade. He must seek to drive us off before we get close enough to see that, unaware as he is that we already know."
"And us, sir?" the Premier asked, emboldened by this display of openness.
"Why, in order to carry out the plan I have in mind, we must get past him, either by fighting him or, since we have the wind, outsailing him."
"If we slip past him, sir, we hand him the wind."
"That is true, Mr. Glaister,"
said Ralph Berkeley, dropping his telescope and looking directly at his junior officer.
"Which is why I expect to fight him at some point. But I will add that I wish that point to be one of my own choosing. Mr. Collins, ease the braces a fraction. I want some of the way taken off the ship. But I desire to give our friend yonder the appearance that we are sailing at our best."